The moment Victor Hargrove rode onto Raven Creek Ranch, he didn't knock. He didn't wait. He rode his horse straight through the yard gate like the land already belonged to him, his 2 hired men flanking him like shadows, and he reined up 10 feet from where Caleb Mercer stood, holding a fence post, sweat-soaked and tired from a morning's work. "Mercer," Hargrove said, not getting down from the saddle. He never got down. That was the thing about Hargrove. He conducted all his business from horseback, because he believed men on the ground had to look up at him. "I've had my surveyor out to the western line again. Turns out you've been grazing my pasture for the better part of 3 years." Caleb set the fence post down slowly. "That pasture has been Raven Creek land since my father filed the grant." Hargrove smiled. It wasn't a friendly smile. "Your father was a lot of things, Caleb. Careful wasn't one of them." He turned his horse without another word, rode back through the gate he'd never bothered to close, and left Caleb standing in the yard with the kind of cold dread that doesn't shout. It just settles in your chest like a stone dropped in still water. What Hargrove didn't know, and what nobody in Raven Creek could have predicted, was that the answer to his threat was already inside the ranch house. She'd been there 3 weeks. She'd arrived with worn-out boots, $4.30, and no real reason to believe things would go any differently than they always had. Her name was Evelyn Hart, and she was the last person anyone would have expected to save a ranch. If you've ever been told you were too much, too loud, too big, too rough around the edges, too something that nobody could quite name, but everybody seemed to agree on, then you already know something about what it feels like to be Evelyn Hart. And if this story speaks to you, stay with us. Subscribe to the channel so you don't miss what comes next. Hit that like button and drop a comment telling us the city or country you're watching from. I want to see exactly how far this story travels. Now, let's go back to the beginning. The man at the feed store didn't even let her finish her sentence. Evelyn had been standing at the counter for 2 minutes, waiting for him to stop pretending to sort invoices and actually look at her. When he finally did, his eyes moved over her the way people's eyes sometimes did taking inventory, arriving at a conclusion, filing it away, and then he went back to his papers. "We're not hiring," he said. "I didn't ask if you were hiring. I asked if you needed a cook for the crew lunches. We manage fine. You've got 6 men eating cold biscuits out of a tin on your loading dock. I watched them for 20 minutes. He looked up then, but not with any interest. More the way a man looks at something that's making a noise he can't immediately identify. The answer's still no. Evelyn stood there for one more moment. She had learned, through years of practice, exactly how long she could hold that moment before it stopped being dignity and started being embarrassing. She'd gotten very precise about it. She turned and walked out. The sun outside was already past its peak, which meant she'd spent the better part of the morning making her way through Raven Creek's small commercial strip, the dry goods store, the blacksmiths, the livery, the feed store, and the answer had been the same at every stop. Not always that blunt. Sometimes it came wrapped in fake regret. "We've just filled the position. We're not sure the work would suit you. We'll keep your name." Nobody kept her name. She knew that. She had 4.3. The coins were in a small cloth pouch in her coat pocket, and she'd counted them that morning without meaning to. The way you count things when you're nervous and trying to feel like you have some control over something. She was 25 years old, and she'd been cooking since she was 9. She'd worked kitchens in Billings, a boarding house in Miles City, a cattle outfit near Glendive, that paid her half what they'd have paid a man for the same work. She'd been let go from that last job not because her food was bad. The foreman had told her, to his credit, that her biscuits were the best he'd ever eaten, but because the owner's wife had visited the ranch and had opinions about what a woman working among men ought to look like. That had been 6 weeks ago. She stood on the main street of Raven Creek, Montana Territory, in the summer of 1887, and she looked down the road toward the edge of town where it turned into open country. The mountains were in the distance, blue and indifferent. The sky was enormous and cloudless. She had 4.3. And she had 2 options: spend some of it on a room tonight and wake up tomorrow with the same problem and less money, or walk 14 miles west to Raven Creek Ranch and ask for work there. She'd heard about Raven Creek Ranch at the rooming house that morning, from a woman who was hanging laundry and had no particular reason to be helpful but was anyway. "Caleb Mercer's place," the woman had said. "Cook left 3 weeks ago. He's been feeding those hands out of cans ever since. 12 men if you count the boy." Evelyn had counted the distance in her head. 14 miles. She was wearing boots that had been resoled once already, and were developing a new opinion about gravel roads. She started walking. She arrived at Raven Creek Ranch at 4:30 in the afternoon. Her feet hurt in a specific and personal way that had moved beyond pain into something almost conversational, each step a comment, a complaint, a running negotiation. She'd stopped twice along the road, once to drink from a creek and once to sit on a rock, and take her right boot off, and look at the blister on her heel with the detached assessment of someone who has decided to be practical about suffering. The ranch came into view gradually, first the roof line, then the fence posts, then the full shape of it. It was a working ranch, not a pretty one. The main house was solid but unadorned, weathered gray in the way that wood gets when it's been through enough winters. The barn was larger than the house. There were 3 horses in the near paddock, and the smell of livestock and hay and wood smoke in the air. A man was in the yard. He was somewhere in his mid-30s, tall with dark hair that needed cutting and a jaw that hadn't seen a razor in a few days. He was repairing something on the fence line. Evelyn couldn't quite tell what, and he didn't look up when she came through the gate, because the gate made no sound, and she made no particular announcement of herself. She stopped about 10 feet from him and said, "Mr. Mercer." He looked up. His eyes were the kind of gray-blue that doesn't commit to either color. He looked at her the way Caleb Mercer, she would later learn, looked at most things, like he was deciding whether it was going to be a problem. "That's me," he said. "My name is Evelyn Hart. I heard your cook left and you haven't replaced him. I'm here about the position." He set down whatever he was holding, a length of wire. She saw now and straightened up. He was quiet for a moment, in a way that wasn't rude, exactly, but wasn't particularly encouraging either. "Where'd you work before?" "Billings, Miles City, and 3 years on a cattle outfit outside Glendive." "Why'd you leave the cattle outfit?" She looked at him steadily. "The owner's wife didn't like the way I looked." Something shifted in his expression. Not sympathy, it wasn't soft enough for that. More like recognition. Like a man who'd heard enough human nonsense in his life to recognize one more variety of it. "Can you cook for 12 men?" he asked. "We is at 6. Kitchen's through the back of the house. Go take a look and tell me what you can do with what's in there." He picked the wire back up and went back to the fence. Evelyn stood for a moment, unsure if that had been a yes or a test or both. Then she walked to the back of the house and went inside. The kitchen was a catastrophe. Not filthy, whoever had been managing it in the interim had kept it from actual ruin, but it was the kitchen of a place that had given up on itself. The iron stove had a crack in its firebox plate that had been patched with something that wasn't a proper patch. One of the oven doors hung wrong on its hinge. The work table had a warped surface that nothing would sit flat on without wedging. Half the shelving was bare. The other half held a sack of dried beans, a small bag of cornmeal, 2 tins of salted beef, a jar of a handful of dried apples, salt, a little coffee, and some aging flour that had started to show the particular grayness that meant it wasn't going to last much longer. Evelyn stood in the middle of the kitchen and looked at all of it for a long time. 12 men. In 90 minutes, she pulled the flour bin toward her and pressed her hand into it, feeling for moisture, checking the smell. Usable, but barely. She checked the lard, adequate. She looked at the cornmeal and the beans and did the arithmetic in her head. Beans took too long, not tonight. She opened the salted beef tins and smelled them. Both fine. She went to the stove, found kindling in the box beside it, and started building a fire. The cracked firebox meant she'd have to manage the heat differently, less aggressive, more patient. She'd cooked on worse. Not much worse, but worse. The dried apples went into a pot with water and a little of the sugar she'd found in a tin at the back of a shelf. Enough for sweetness, but not enough for a real dessert. They'd reduced down. She'd figure that part out later. The salted beef she cut into pieces and started in the skillet with lard and onion. There was a string of dried onions hanging near the door that she'd spotted immediately, and she let it go slow, rendering the fat down, getting the salt to mellow, and the meat to soften. The skillet was too small for the quantity she needed, which meant she'd have to work in stages and keep things warm. She found a Dutch oven and put the cornmeal on. Cornbread in the Dutch oven, done right, came out with a crust that knocked against the spoon when you tapped it, and a soft inside that held up to being passed around a table. She'd made it so many times she didn't think about the proportions anymore. Her hands just knew. The kitchen filled with heat. The light through the small window shifted toward the gold of late afternoon. She was at the stove, stirring the beef, when she heard the back door open and looked up to find herself being stared at by a boy of about 12. He was small for his age, or maybe just thin in the way of a child who'd been through some things, with dark, serious eyes and dirt on his elbows, and an expression that suggested he'd been expecting something else when he came in and was now recalculating. "Who are you?" he said. "Evelyn Hart. Who are you?" "Miles Carter." He looked past her at the stove, at the pots, at the Dutch oven sitting in the coals. His nose was working. "Is that cornbread?" "It will be." Charlie never made cornbread. Charlie mostly just opened tins. "Who's Charlie, the last cook?" He left because Gideon kept telling him his coffee tasted like boot water. Did it? Miles considered this seriously. "A little bit," he admitted. Evelyn turned back to the stove. "Wash your hands and come help me." He didn't argue. That surprised her. He went to the basin, washed his hands with the actual seriousness of someone who'd been told why it mattered. and came back to the work table. "What do I do?" he asked. "See those dried apples in the pot? Stir them. Don't let them stick to the bottom." He picked up the spoon and stirred. He was quiet for a moment, watching the apples soften and darken in the water. "Are you going to stay?" he asked. "I don't know yet," Evelyn said. "Ask me in a couple of hours." They came in at 6, all of them. 12 men filing through the back door of the house into the room adjacent to the kitchen where the long table sat. The same table that had apparently served mostly as a surface for laying tools and paperwork since Charlie left. Someone had cleared it. Evelyn hadn't done that. She'd been at the stove and she suspected it was Miles, though she didn't ask. She heard them before she saw them. Their boots on the floorboards, the scrape of chairs, the low rumble of men talking in the compressed way of people who've been working hard since sunrise and don't have a lot of words left. Then one voice, sharper than the others, carrying through the wall. "What's that smell?" She couldn't hear the response. "It's not beans from a tin, is what it's not," the voice said. "What's going on in there?" She served them herself, carrying the food out in the Dutch oven in the large skillet, setting the cornbread in the center of the table, ladling the beef into the serving bowl she'd found on the top shelf after 15 minutes of looking. Miles carried the apple pot, carefully, with both hands, his tongue pressed between his teeth in concentration. The men looked at the food. Then they looked at her. One of them, a lean, weathered man in his 40s with a jaw set at an angle that suggested he'd made up his mind about most things, already looked her over in a way that was less assessment than verdict. He had a reddish-brown mustache and the kind of eyes that have spent so much time squinting into the distance that they've forgotten how to open all the way. "Who are you?" he said. His name, she would learn, was Gideon Cole. "Evelyn Hart. I'm the cook." "Mercer hired you?" "He's considering it." "Considering it," Gideon repeated, with the particular tone of a man who has found an error in someone else's paperwork. "Eat your supper," Evelyn said. "Then tell me what you think." She turned and went back to the kitchen. She stood at the stove and listened. First there was the sound of serving, the clink of the ladle, the scrape of the spoon against the pan. Then silence. Not the silence of men eating without appetite, but a different kind of silence. The kind that happens when something is worth paying attention to. And someone said quietly, "Hell." And someone else said, "Pass the cornbread." And then the sound changed entirely. It became the sound of eating, real eating, which is different from the sound of men just putting food in their mouths. There was a fullness to it, a settledness. Miles appeared in the kitchen doorway, eyes bright. "Gideon took 2 pieces of cornbread," he whispered. "Don't tell him I know that," Evelyn said. Caleb Mercer came to find her after supper. She was washing the pots, which was not a task she'd been asked to do, but which she had started because she couldn't leave a kitchen looking like that, and also because it gave her something to do with her hands while she waited to find out if she had a job. He stood in the doorway with his hat in his hand, not a performative gesture, just a man who'd been taught to take his hat off indoors and did it without thinking, and he watched her for a moment before he spoke. "The men are sitting at the table," he said. She looked at him. Still. Gideon's talking about something that happened 3 years ago that I've never heard him mention before. 2 of the other men are laughing." He paused. "They haven't done that at the supper table since." He stopped there. She waited, but he didn't finish the sentence. "The position's yours," he said instead. $1.50 a week, room included. Kitchen's yours to manage. I'd ask you to make a list of what you need, and I'll send to town." Evelyn set the pot down and dried her hands on the cloth she'd tucked into her waistband. "I'll need that stoveplate fixed properly. The patch won't hold. I'll get the blacksmith out and that oven hinge. Yes, and flour that isn't 3 months old. I'll send Miles tomorrow." She looked at him. He looked at her. There was something in his expression that she couldn't quite read. Not warmth, not exactly, but something adjacent to it, like a door that was shut but not locked. "One more thing," she said. "What?" "If I'm running this kitchen, it's my kitchen. The men can complain to me directly. They don't send complaints through anyone else, and they don't take it out on the food or the equipment or the boy. If they have a problem with the cooking, they say so to my face." Caleb was quiet for a moment. "Fair," he said. He put his hat back on and went back out into the evening. Evelyn turned back to the sink. Her hands were in the water before she let herself exhale, long and slow, the kind of breath that carries 3 weeks of strain out with it. She had a job. She had a kitchen. She thought, possibly more than she'd had in a very long time. The first 3 days were a trial in every sense of the word. Not because the kitchen was difficult, she'd made peace with its limitations within the first hour, and had already started cataloging what she'd need to make it functional. The difficulty was the men, or rather one man in particular, and the particular way he made his difficulty felt. Gideon Cole had eaten 2 pieces of her cornbread at that first supper. She knew it. Miles had confirmed it. But by the following morning, Gideon Cole had apparently decided that any softening on his part the previous evening had been a momentary lapse. and he had returned to his factory setting, which was skeptical of everything and vocal about it. He came through the kitchen at 5:30 the first morning, before she'd gotten the stove fully going, and stood in the doorway looking at the state of things with the expression of a man reviewing a disappointing situation. "Coffee's not ready," he said. "It will be in 10 minutes. Charlie had coffee ready at 5. Evelyn kept her back to him, feeding wood into the stove. "Then you should have kept Charlie." A pause. "His coffee tasted like boot water. Then you didn't lose much." She heard him make a sound that was not quite a laugh and not quite anything else, and then his boots on the floor going back the way he'd come. The second morning he came in and looked at the breakfast she was preparing: biscuits, bacon, fried potatoes, and said, "Those biscuits look flat." They were not flat. They were in the oven and he could not see them, a fact which she pointed out. "They looked flat yesterday," he said. "Yesterday I made cornbread." Still, by the third morning she had made a decision. When Gideon came in and opened his mouth, she turned from the stove and looked at him with the specific quality of attention that stops a man mid-syllable. "Sit down," she said. "I'm not here to sit. I'm here to put—" Gideon, she said his name once evenly. "Sit down." He sat. It seemed to surprise him that he'd done it. She poured him a cup of coffee, the good coffee, properly made, the kind that smelled like itself, and set it in front of him. Then she pulled out the stool across from him and sat down herself, which was not something women in her position normally did, and she looked at him straight. "You've been doing this 3 days," she said, "every morning, every meal. And I want to know something. Is it the food or is it me?" He wrapped his hands around the coffee cup. His jaw worked for a moment. "I don't know you," he said finally. "That's true. Charlie was here 4 years and you hated his coffee. That's not—" He stopped. "I'm not saying the cooking is bad." "Then what are you saying?" He was quiet for a moment. Outside, the morning sounds of the ranch were starting: horses moving, boots on the bunkhouse steps, someone calling to someone else across the yard. "This kitchen was Margaret's," he said. "Mercer's wife. She died 4 years back. And every cook that's come through since—" He stopped again, shook his head. "It doesn't matter." "It matters," Evelyn said, "or you wouldn't still be angry about it." He looked at her. It was the first time he'd really looked at her, not assessed, not dismissed, but looked. "She was good people," he said. "Caleb was different when she was here." "The whole place was different, I know," Evelyn said. "I can tell." She stood up and went back to the stove. "The biscuits will be ready in 8 minutes," she said. "And they're not flat." She found out about Margaret Mercer the way you find out most things on a ranch, gradually in pieces, from different people at different times. From Miles, who'd arrived at the ranch as an orphaned child of 8 and had been taken in by Caleb without ceremony or particular announcement, she learned that Margaret had been the person who'd made Miles feel like he was allowed to take up space. "She never made me feel like I was extra," Miles said once, carefully, while peeling potatoes, "like I was a problem to be solved." From one of the older hands, a man called Roy, who was quiet most of the time but occasionally said things of real precision, she learned that Margaret had died of a fever in January of 1883, and that Caleb had gone through the following year without speaking more than he absolutely needed to. She did not ask Caleb directly. She had the sense that with Caleb, certain things needed to come around on their own time if they came at all. What she could see with her own eyes was that the ranch ran on competence and stubbornness, and not much else. Caleb Mercer knew cattle and land and weather and the mechanical demands of keeping a working outfit alive. He did not know how to make a place feel lived in. He did not know, or had forgotten, how to sit still in the evenings. He ate fast and left the table fast, and spent his evenings in the small office off the main room, going over books or papers or staring at maps of the property, with the intensity of a man who's trying to think his way out of something. The men were loyal to him. She could see that clearly. But it was a loyalty that had grown up in a kind of emotional vacancy: men who respected their employer and would work hard for him and would not leave, but who did not go home to the bunkhouse at night, feeling anything particular except tired. She thought about all of this while she cooked, which was where she did most of her thinking. She thought about it while she figured out that dried apples, reconstituted slowly and cooked down with a little of the cinnamon she'd had Roy bring back from town, made a sauce that you could serve over cornbread, and that 3 of the men had asked about with their eyes before any of them asked about it with their mouths. She thought about it while she had started keeping the coffee pot warm throughout the evening, so that if someone came in from a late task, there was something hot waiting without them having to ask. She thought about it while she began, without making any announcement about it, to leave the kitchen light on later than Charlie apparently had, so that the glow from the window was visible from the bunkhouse in the yard. A kitchen with its light on is not a complicated thing, but it tells you something. It tells you someone's in there. It tells you there's a place that is presently occupied and warm, and where there is probably food. It is a very old kind of signal, Miles noticed first. You leave the lamp going late, he said. It's easier than relighting it, Evelyn said. Miles gave her a look that suggested he understood perfectly well that this was not the real reason. It was on the 11th day that she understood something had shifted. She'd been up since before sunrise, a habit she'd never been able to break. Something about the quality of the early morning that she'd always found easier to use than to sleep through, and she'd made bread, and gotten the breakfast started, and was standing at the window with a cup of coffee when she heard boots on the porch outside. The door opened. It was Caleb. He stopped when he saw her there, which meant he hadn't expected her to be up yet. Or maybe hadn't expected anyone to be up. He looked like a man who'd come to a place expecting it to be empty and had found it wasn't. Morning, he said. Morning, she said. Coffee's hot. He came in and poured himself a cup and stood at the other side of the kitchen with it, not talking, just being present in the same space, which was, she was starting to understand, Caleb Mercer's version of companionship. He was not a man who needed to fill silence. He just needed to not be completely alone in it. They stood like that for a while. I had a visitor yesterday, he said finally. While you were in town with Miles, I heard. He looked at her. Roy mentioned someone came by, she said. Victor Hargrove. He said the name the way you say the name of a weather condition, factual, without drama, but with the steady awareness of what that weather can do. He says his surveyor puts the western boundary line a quarter-mile east of where my father's map shows it. Wants me to pull the fence back. Evelyn held her coffee cup in both hands. And what does your deed say? My deed says what my father always said it said. But Hargrove's got money and he's got men who'll swear to anything he tells them to, and he's been picking up land in this valley for 2 years. 3 ranches have already sold to him. One of them didn't exactly choose to. What does that mean? Caleb looked at the window. It means their well ran dry unexpectedly, and their hay caught fire. Twice, and eventually selling seemed like the easier option. The kitchen was quiet. Outside, the early sounds of the ranch were beginning: horses, boots, voices. Are you worried? She asked. He was quiet for a long moment. I've been managing this ranch for 11 years, he said, since I was 22 years old. My father built it from nothing on land that nobody else wanted, in a valley that flooded twice and froze 3 times and nearly went under twice more. I'm not going to give it to Victor Hargrove, he said it simply, not with bravado, just as a fact. No, Evelyn said. You're not. He looked at her, then really looked at her, the way he hadn't quite done before. Not with assessment or estimation, but with the particular attention of a man who has just heard something that surprised him. What had surprised him, she thought, was not her agreement. It was the certainty in her voice, the absence of any hedge. She turned back to the stove. Breakfast in 20 minutes, she said. He went out. She stood at the stove and listened to his boots cross the porch and descend into the yard, and she thought about a man who had been carrying something heavy for a very long time, and didn't know yet that he didn't have to carry all of it alone. She would not have known how to say that to him. Not yet. Not with any words that didn't sound like too much. But she could keep the coffee hot. She could keep the light on. She could be in the kitchen when he came through the door, at an hour when he'd expected to find nobody. You build trust the way you build a fire in a cracked stove, carefully, with full attention to what you're working with, and you don't stop feeding it just because the first flame is small. She put another log in and turned back to the bread. The day had not yet fully arrived, and already it was asking things of everyone at Raven Creek. Evelyn rolled her sleeves back down, straightened her apron, and got to work the way she always had, and the way she intended to keep on doing, for as long as this place would have her. The bread Evelyn made on the morning of Hargrove's second visit was the best bread she'd made since arriving at Raven Creek. She knew at the moment it came out of the oven, the crust had that particular sound when you tapped it, a low, resonant knock that meant the inside had done what it was supposed to do, and the smell that came off it was the kind of smell that changes the quality of a room. She'd set it on the work table to cool and stood back and looked at it with the quiet satisfaction of someone who has done a thing exactly right. Then she heard the horses in the yard, and the satisfaction curdled into something else entirely. She didn't go to the window immediately. She finished wiping down the work table, hung the cloth, and then, because she was not a woman who pretended, she wasn't curious about things, she went to the window and looked. Hargrove had brought 4 men this time. The previous visit, Roy had told her, had been 2. 4 was a statement. 4 was a man who wanted you to count the number of men he'd brought and feel something about it. Hargrove himself was the same as Roy had described him, heavyset in the way of a man who'd once been physically powerful and had let money do the work for a while, with a broad face and the kind of mustache that required maintenance, and therefore communicated that he was a man who paid attention to appearances. He was riding a horse that cost more than most men in this valley earned in a year. Caleb came out of the barn. He'd been in there since after breakfast, working on something with the door half open, And he walked out now with his sleeves rolled up and grease on his forearms and the relaxed alertness of a man who'd been expecting this visit and had decided not to be rattled by it. Evelyn watched from the window. She couldn't hear what was being said, the glass was too thick and the distance too great, but she could read the shape of it. Hargrove talking at length, gesturing toward the western fence line, then toward the house. Caleb listening with his arms crossed, not moving, not nodding. One of Hargrove's men dismounting without being told to, which was the kind of thing men do when they want to make a situation feel more crowded than it is. Caleb said something short. Whatever it was, it made Hargrove's face change. Hargrove pointed at Caleb, an actual pointing, index finger extended, and said something that went on for several seconds. Then he turned his horse, and the 4 men followed, and they rode back through the gate, and Caleb stood watching them go with the stillness of a man who has been angry before and knows what to do with it. Miles appeared at Evelyn's elbow. She hadn't heard him come in. 4 men this time, he said. I counted. Last time was 2. He paused. Roy says Hargrove bought the Kellerman place with 4 men and a lawyer. The Hendersons took 3 weeks to sell after Hargrove brought 4 men. Evelyn looked at him. He was 12 years old and he was doing arithmetic about intimidation tactics because he lived in a place where that kind of arithmetic had become necessary. Go slice that bread, she said carefully. And don't cut yourself. Caleb didn't say anything about the visit at lunch. He ate, and he answered direct questions from the men in direct sentences, and then he went back out. Evelyn watched this and said nothing. It was Gideon who brought it up unprompted at the supper table that evening. Not to Evelyn, to the other men, but in the kitchen's general direction, in the way people talk when they want to be overheard, without having to admit they want to be overheard. Hargrove's not going to let it go, Gideon said. You all know that. A man named Pete, who was one of the younger hands and had the look of someone trying to figure out when to be worried, said, Caleb's got the deed. Hargrove doesn't care about the deed. He cares about what the surveyor says, and the surveyor works for Hargrove. Can he do that? Just get his own man to say. He already did it to the Kellermans. Their surveyor and his surveyor had the boundary line in 2 different places, and it took long enough in the territorial court that the Kellermans ran out of money before the thing was settled. Silence at the table, the sound of forks. Someone refilling a coffee cup. Caleb's not the Kellermans, another man said. No, Gideon said. But he's not made of money either. Evelyn came out with the apple cake she'd made. She'd stretched the dried apples further, with some preserved plums she'd found in the cellar that nobody had apparently remembered were down there, and set it on the table. She did this without comment or ceremony, and the men shifted to make room for it, and for a moment the conversation stopped. Then she said, from the doorway, the Kellermans didn't have the land grant registered in the territorial office, did they? Caleb's father did. Gideon looked at her. How do you know that? Roy mentioned it. I've been listening. Gideon's jaw worked for a moment. Listening doesn't win a boundary dispute. No, she said. But knowing the right questions to ask might. She looked around the table. Who's been here longest besides Caleb? A pause. Then Roy, at the far end of the table, raised one weathered hand slightly. Walter Briggs, he said. He was here before me. He's been on and off, his back gives him trouble, and he works light duty when it does, but he's been around this ranch longer than most. I'll talk to him, Evelyn said. Gideon looked at her with an expression she was starting to be able to parse. It was not hostility anymore, not exactly. It was the look of a man recalibrating, of someone who had filed a thing under a certain heading and was now finding out the heading was wrong. You're the cook, he said. Yes, she said, I am. And you're all going to have apple cake before it gets cold. She went back to the kitchen. Behind her she heard the sound of the plate being passed. She found Walter Briggs the following afternoon, sitting in the thin shade on the south side of the barn, mending a piece of leather harness with the slow concentration of a man who'd learned that slow was not the same as wrong. He was somewhere past 60, with hands that were knotted at the joints, and a face that had been weathered past the point where you could guess his age within a decade in either direction. He moved carefully, the way people do when their body has become something they have to negotiate with. Mr. Briggs, she said. I'm Evelyn Hart. I know who you are, he said, without looking up from the harness. You're the one who fixed the stove. The blacksmith fixed the stove. You told him how. He squinted at a stitch. Word gets around. She sat down on the upturned crate near him, not asking, just sitting, the way you do when you want to make clear you're not in a hurry, and neither should he be. I want to ask you something about the land grant, she said. The original filing. Were you here when Caleb's father did it? He was quiet for a moment. The harness needle went in and came back out. I was here, he said. I was 19 years old and Thomas Mercer hired me on for the summer, and I ended up staying. He filed the grant in the fall of '59, went to the territorial office himself, and I rode with him because he needed someone to hold the horses. You were there, in the office. Stood outside mostly. But I saw him come back out with the papers, saw the seal on them. Thomas Mercer was a careful man, not like some of these ranchers who filed on a handshake and a prayer. He did everything through the proper channels. The official who processed it, do you remember anything about him? Walter Briggs looked up from his work for the first time. His eyes were pale blue and sharp in a way that his slow movements didn't suggest. "Why are you asking about the official?" he said. "'Cause I think that's where Hargrove is going to go next," Evelyn said. "He can't win the boundary argument if Caleb's deed is properly registered. So he's going to try something else. And the something else, if I had to guess, is going to be about whether the original grant was legitimate." Walter was quiet for a long time. A horse moved inside the barn, shuffling its feet on the straw. "The official's name was Aldrich," he said finally. "Paul Aldrich. He was a perfectly ordinary little man in a perfectly ordinary little office, and he stamped the papers and wrote the date in his book, and Thomas Mercer shook his hand, and that was it. Nothing wrong about any of it. Would you be willing to say that to a lawyer?" Another long silence. "I'm an old man with a bad back and no particular interest in being involved in anything complicated," Walter Briggs said. "I know," Evelyn said. "I'm sorry to ask." He looked at her. Something moved in his expression that was hard to name, not irritation, not resignation, but something between recognition and weariness. "Caleb's a good man," he said. "Yes," she said, "he is. His father was a good man, from what I can tell." Walter looked back at the harness. His needle went in, came back out. "I'll talk to the lawyer," he said. The week that followed was the strangest of Evelyn's time at Raven Creek, because everything on the surface appeared almost normal. Meals were cooked and eaten. The men worked the fence lines and moved the cattle. Miles learned how to make proper gravy without the lumps that had been defeating him, and underneath all of it ran a current that everybody could feel, and nobody was naming directly. Caleb had been to see a lawyer in town, a man named Dressler, apparently, who had an office above the land registry, and who had handled the territory's property disputes for 20 years. Caleb had come back from that meeting with the same expression he wore after most difficult things: composed, quiet, a little tighter around the eyes. He told the men at supper, all of them, because he ran the ranch that way, where the men who'd given their working lives to the place deserved to know what they were working toward, that Dressler believed the boundary dispute would hold in court. The deed and the land grant were properly filed. The survey Hargrove had commissioned would be challenged by an independent survey. "That's the boundary question," Caleb said. "But Dressler says Hargrove may not stop there." Nobody spoke. "There are other ways to challenge a land title," Caleb said. "More complicated ones. Dressler wants to be ready for that." Gideon, who had been unusually quiet through this, set his fork down. "He's going to try to say the original grant was corrupt?" "Dressler thinks it's possible." "That's Caleb, that's Thomas Mercer's legacy. Your father's whole claim to this land." "I know what it is, Gideon." The table was very still. Then Roy said quietly, "Walter Briggs was there when Thomas filed." "I know," Caleb said. He looked down the table at Evelyn, and it was a brief look, not long enough to mean anything specific, but specific enough that she knew he was aware of who had brought Walter Briggs into this. She said nothing. She refilled the coffee cups. The rumors started on a Thursday. Evelyn didn't know they'd started until Friday morning, when Miles came back from an errand in town with a look on his face that was trying very hard to be blank and failing at it. She let him get his boots off and get a drink of water, and then she said, "What happened?" "Nothing," he said. "Miles." He sat down at the kitchen table. He was 12, and he was trying to be stoic about something, and it wasn't working, because he was 12. "Mrs. Alderton said something," he said to her daughter. "I was in the dry goods store and they didn't see me." Evelyn waited. She said you were. He stopped. She said it wasn't right. "A woman like you living out here with all those men." She said Caleb ought to know better and that you were. His jaw was tight. "I don't want to say what she called you." Evelyn was quiet for a moment. She stood at the stove with the coffee pot in her hand, and she was very still. "You don't have to say it," she said. "It was a bad word." "I know what word it was." He looked up at her. His eyes were angry in the way of a child who has not yet had enough time to develop the particular armor that anger requires before it can be worn in public. It was raw and it was real, and it made something in her chest do a complicated thing. "It's not true," he said. "I know it's not. You should go into town and tell her. That's not how this works, sweetheart." It was the first time she'd called him that. It came out without her deciding to say it, and they both noticed it. And then Miles looked back at the table because he was 12, and he didn't know what to do with being called sweetheart by a woman who was not his mother. And Evelyn turned back to the stove because she didn't entirely know what to do with having said it. "Then how does it work?" he said after a moment. She put the coffee pot down. She thought about it seriously because he was asking seriously. "People say things like that when they're afraid of something they don't understand," she said. "A woman showing up alone and finding work and doing it well, that makes some people uncomfortable. It doesn't fit into what they think women are supposed to do or look like or be. And when people are uncomfortable, they explain it away by making it something wrong. Doesn't make any sense. No, she said. It doesn't. He was quiet then. Is that why they kept not giving you work? In town? She looked at him. Before you came here, he said. Roy said you walked 14 miles. He said you'd been turned away from every place in town. She had not known Roy knew that. She supposed it wasn't surprising. Roy was the kind of man who quietly knew most things. Yes, she said, that's part of why. Miles turned his cup on the table, around and around. I got turned away from a lot of places too, he said. Before Caleb, she waited, because I was small, and because I didn't have anybody. People look at you like, he stopped. Like you're going to be a problem. Before you've done anything, yes, she said, exactly like that. They sat with that for a moment, the two of them, in the kitchen that was getting warm from the stove, with the morning light coming through the window at an angle. She was wrong, Miles said. Mrs. Alderton, she was, Evelyn said. Now help me with the biscuits, she told Caleb that evening. She hadn't planned to. She'd thought about it for most of the afternoon, turning it over, and she'd nearly decided not to say anything, because Caleb had enough to carry, and a nasty rumor from a woman in the dry goods store seemed small against a land dispute with a man like Hargrove. But then she thought about what not telling him would mean, the slow corrosion of something unsaid, the way it would sit between them like an unacknowledged thing, and she decided the only honest option was to say it directly. She waited until after supper, when the kitchen was clean and the men had gone to the bunkhouse and Miles had gone to his room. She found Caleb in the office, standing at the map on the wall, the one showing the property lines of Raven Creek, pencil annotations in two different handwritings, his and his father's. There are rumors in town, she said. He turned. She told him plainly, without softening it, what Miles had overheard, what Mrs. Alderton had said, what words she'd used. Caleb's face went through several things in quick succession. The first was a flash of anger, the specific kind of anger that has a target, a heat behind the eyes, and then that compressed itself into something tighter and colder. I'll speak, he started. Don't, she said. That's not the way to handle it. Going to a woman's door to defend me makes it look like there's something to defend. It makes it bigger. Then what do you suggest? She'd been thinking about this since the afternoon. A Sunday gathering. Not a church social, just neighbors out here at the ranch. Plenty of space, food. The kind of thing that ordinary families do when they want to be part of a community. She paused. If people see us, me, you, the men, Miles, as an ordinary household going about ordinary life, it's harder for the rumor to hold. It needs isolation to survive. Bring people in and it dies. Caleb looked at her for a long moment. You want to host a gathering, he said, in the middle of a land dispute. I want to stop a rumor before it does more damage than it's already done, she said. Hargrove may have started it, or it may have started on its own. These things do. But either way, the answer is the same. He turned back to the map. She watched his hands, which were clasped behind his back and very still. You're not afraid of this, he said. It wasn't quite a question. I'm afraid of plenty of things, she said. I'm afraid of this ranch going under. I'm afraid of what happens to Miles if it does. I'm afraid of wasting another year being turned away from places because of what I look like before I've even opened my mouth. She paused. But I'm not afraid of Mrs. Alderton and what she says in a dry goods store. So no, not of that. Caleb was quiet for a long time. Sunday after next, he said. I'll need a proper food budget, she said, and Miles's help for 2 full days. Done. She turned to go and he said her name. Not Miss Hart, just Evelyn. It was the first time he'd used her name. She turned back. Thank you, he said, for telling me directly. It was the only honest way to do it, she said. She went back to the kitchen. She stood at the sink and looked at her reflection in the dark window glass, and she thought about all the places she had not been wanted, all the doors that had opened just far enough for someone to tell her no. And she thought about a kitchen with a cracked stove and a warped work table and a lamp she left burning late every evening, and she thought, well, here we are. Let's see what we can make of it. The Sunday gathering was not a polished event. Evelyn had not aimed for polished and would not have known how to deliver it if she had. What she aimed for was real, and real was what came out. 11 families from the surrounding area, 4 of them people Caleb knew well, and the rest people he knew well enough to invite. The Hollister family from the neighboring spread to the north. Roy's sister and her husband, who farmed a little east. Doc Parsons from Raven Creek proper, who came to everything because he said his patients stopped being honest with him if he didn't maintain a social presence. A minister's wife whose husband was away. Evelyn noted her arrival, and noted that she had sharp eyes and a reputation, Roy had told her, for being the one person in the valley whose opinion moved other people's opinions. Evelyn cooked for 2 days. Not fancy food, nothing that would make people feel like they were being performed at, but the kind of food that takes time and care, and tells you something about who made it. Bread in 4 varieties because she'd found she could manage the oven better now that the hinge was fixed. 2 pots of stew that she'd started the previous afternoon and let go slow overnight. an apple cake with the preserved plum filling that had become, apparently, a matter of some reputation. Roy had let that slip before the event, and she'd had to make 3 of them. Miles had worked beside her the entire time without complaint, which was saying something for a boy of 12 who'd been asked to peel potatoes and stir things at intervals for 48 hours. He was good company, Miles. He talked when it was worth talking and was quiet when quiet was better, and he was developing a genuine instinct for the cooking, the kind that can't be taught, the instinct for when something needs to come off the heat before you plan to take it off. She'd told him that. He'd stood very straight and said, "Really? Really," she'd said. "You're not just helping me. You're learning." There's a difference. He'd been different after that for the rest of the preparation. More deliberate. Like a boy who'd been told he was doing a real thing and was now doing it with the seriousness it deserved. The gathering itself was ordinary in the best possible way. People arrived, ate, stood in the yard and talked, watched the horses, let their children run. The men of the ranch circulated with the ease of people who'd been told to be sociable and had decided to try, which was imperfect but sincere. Gideon, to Evelyn's private amazement, held an extended conversation with Doc Parsons about the treatment of a horse's tendon injury that turned into a conversation about human tendon injuries and ended with both of them crouching in the yard, looking at something she couldn't see from the window. The minister's wife, her name was Mrs. Holt, found her way to the kitchen in the mid-afternoon, the way certain kinds of women always find their way to wherever the food is being managed. She stood in the doorway and looked around the kitchen with the assessing gaze of someone who understands kitchens. "You've done a great deal with this room," she said. "The blacksmith did the stove," Evelyn said. "I've seen what this kitchen looked like before, Mrs." Holt said. "The room is different, that's not the blacksmith." Evelyn sliced the bread and said nothing. "You're the woman Alderton's been talking about, Mrs." Holt said. There was no cruelty in how she said it. Just the statement of fact by a person who has decided that directness is kinder than pretending. "I expect so," Evelyn said. "She said you were disreputable." "She doesn't know me." "No," Mrs. Holt said, "she doesn't." She came into the kitchen uninvited, which Evelyn respected, because the kitchen was her territory, and only people with real confidence walked into it uninvited and took a piece of bread from the board and ate it standing up, which Evelyn also respected. "This is a household," Mrs. Holt said. "I've been in enough of them to know the difference. This is not what Alderton said it was." "No," Evelyn said, "it isn't." Mrs. Holt looked at her steadily. "Alderton talks to people," she said, "and I talk to people, and that's the end of what I have to say about this particular matter." She took another piece of bread and went back out to the gathering. Evelyn stood at the work table and felt something loosen in her chest that had been tight for a week. Not everything, not the land dispute, not Hargrove, not the complicated and unfinished thing that seemed to live in the space between her and Caleb, but this particular piece of it, the sharp-edged piece that had started with a 12-year-old boy looking at her with his angry, unguarded eyes. That piece, at least, was loosening. After the gathering was over and the families had gone home, and the men had cleaned the yard, and Miles had gone to bed in the boneless way of an exhausted child, Evelyn sat on the porch steps with a cup of cold coffee and let herself be still for a minute. Caleb came and sat beside her. Not close, there was a foot of space between them, and he didn't say anything for a while. And she didn't either, because neither of them needed to fill the silence at this point. "Mrs. Holt talked to several people today," he said finally. "I noticed. Whatever she said, it seemed to land. She has that effect, apparently." He leaned forward, elbows on his knees, looking out at the dark yard. The last of the horses were settling in the paddock. Somewhere out past the barn, something in the grass was making a sound. "You handled this right," he said, the gathering. "What you said about not hiding, you were right. I've had practice," she said, "at figuring out when hiding makes things worse." He looked at her, there in the dark, and the lamplight from the window behind them was just enough to see by. "You're not what I expected," he said, "when you walked through the gate." "What did you expect?" He thought about it seriously, which she appreciated. "I don't know, someone more careful. Around the edges." "I'm careful about plenty of things," she said. "I'm careful about the stove and the bread, and what I say to Miles, and how much of the flour I use before the new supply comes in. I just don't spend that careful on myself." He was quiet. "Margaret used to say something like that," he said. And then he stopped, and the stopping was so complete and so sudden that it was like watching a door close. She didn't push it. She drank her cold coffee and listened to the night sounds of the ranch, and let him have whatever he needed to have in the privacy of that silence. After a while, he stood up and said goodnight and went inside. She stayed on the steps a little longer, thinking about a man who still carried his grief like a second set of bones, and thinking about a boy asleep inside who had learned today that he was actually learning something, and thinking about a kitchen that was becoming slowly and imperfectly, and without any guarantee, a place that belonged to her. Hargrove was still out there, she knew it. Whatever move he was going to make next, It would not be small, because small moves had already not worked, and men like Hargrove did not run out of ideas. They just escalated them. But that was tomorrow. Tonight the ranch was quiet. The lamp in the kitchen was burning. The bread for morning was set to rise under a cloth on the work table. Evelyn finished her coffee, stood up, and went inside. 3 days after the gathering, a letter arrived from Dressler. Caleb read it at the kitchen table, which was where he'd taken to reading anything that came by post, and Evelyn didn't ask about it because she could tell from the way he held the paper that it was not good news, and he would tell her when he'd finished processing it. She kept her back to him and worked the dough she was making, and listened to the sound of him refolding the letter once, then again. Hargrove filed a formal boundary complaint with the Territorial Land Office, he said. When? 4 days ago. Before the gathering. He set the letter on the table, which means he filed it before any of that mattered. He was already moving. She turned. What does Dressler say? He says we respond with the independent survey. He's already commissioned it, a man named Garrett coming up from Helena. Caleb looked at the letter again. He also says we should expect Hargrove to escalate, that the boundary complaint may just be the opening move. Did he say what the next move might be? He had ideas. Caleb's voice was level in the way it got when he was containing something larger underneath. None of them are pleasant. Evelyn pressed it into the pan, covered it with the cloth. She washed her hands and came to the table and sat across from him. Tell me, she said. He looked at her, that particular look, the one she'd started to recognize, where he was deciding how much to say. He was a man who'd been making decisions alone for a long time, and the habit of it ran deep. Dressler says if the boundary claim fails, Hargrove might challenge the original land grant. Whether the filing in 59 was handled correctly. Whether the official involved had the authority he claimed to have. He paused. Whether Thomas Mercer obtained the grant through legitimate means. The kitchen was very quiet. He'd go after your father's name, she said. Yes. She sat with that for a moment. Outside, the morning sounds of the ranch continued indifferent. To all of this, the way the physical world tends to be indifferent. To the things people are afraid of. Then we make sure we're ready for that too, she said. Evelyn Walter already agreed to talk to Dressler. He was there. He saw the filing. She kept her voice practical. Not because she wasn't affected by what she was hearing, she was, more than she'd expected to be, more than she could entirely account for, but because practical was what the situation needed. And Dressler should look into the official himself. Aldrich. What happened to him after 1859? Whether Hargrove has any connection to him. Caleb looked at her steadily. You've been thinking about this, he said. I think about things while I cook, she said. It's a long time to be standing at a stove. Something moved in his expression. Not quite a smile. Caleb Mercer didn't do quick smiles. They required more runway, but something in that direction. I'll write to Dressler, he said. The surveyor named Garrett arrived on a Wednesday, which was a gray day with a wind coming off the mountains that couldn't decide what it wanted to do. He was a compact man in his 50s with a systematic quality about him, the quality of someone who had spent his career being precise about things and had let that precision organize the rest of his personality as well. He brought 2 assistants and a substantial amount of equipment, and he was polite in a way that suggested he was polite to everyone in the same measure, and it didn't mean anything particular. He spent the first day walking the western fence line with Caleb. Evelyn watched them go from the kitchen window. Caleb pointing, Garrett looking, the assistants doing things with instruments she couldn't identify from this distance. She sent Miles out with coffee and biscuits at mid-morning, which was practical, and also her way of getting a report. Miles came back 20 minutes later with an expression that meant he'd been paying attention. They found something, he said. What kind of something? I don't know exactly. Garrett stopped at a place in the fence line, the far northwest corner, and he was talking to Caleb, and Caleb looked like Miles searched for the word. Like when you tell someone something they didn't know but should have. Was it good or bad? I couldn't tell. Neither could Caleb, I think. She thought about the northwest corner of the western fence line. She'd walked a portion of that land once. 2 weeks ago, when she'd gone to look for the creek that Roy had mentioned, gave the western pasture most of its water through the dry months. She'd stood at the bank of it and looked at the water moving and thought about what that water meant to the ranch. And she'd looked at the landmark, a boulder, or what she'd thought at the time was a boulder, split cleanly down the middle by some ancient event, the 2 halves leaning apart from each other, like a book being held open. The split stone, she said. Miles stared at her. How did you know? I saw it. When did I tell Roy where I was going? He said the creek was a 1/4 mile past a split stone. A landmark. Something that can't be moved and can't be argued about. Garrett stopped right at it, Miles said, and started measuring from it. She turned back to the stove with the particular feeling of a thing clicking into place, not satisfaction, not yet. Because satisfaction required knowing the thing had actually worked, but the first feeling that it might. Garrett's full report took 4 more days. In those 4 days, Raven Creek Ranch operated with a quality of suppressed tension that Evelyn felt in the kitchen every morning, in the way the men came in for breakfast quieter than usual, in the way conversation at supper moved around the subject of the survey, the way water moves around a stone, never quite touching it. Gideon, who had become in some way the unofficial barometer of the ranch's emotional weather, was careful and contained, and did not complain about anything, which was more unsettling than his complaints would have been. She cooked through it. There was nothing else to do that was useful, so she was as useful as she could be with what she had. She made the food better and more consistent, and she kept the kitchen clean and the lamp burning and the coffee always hot, and she taught Miles how to make a proper pan sauce because he'd asked, and it gave him something to concentrate on. She also, in the hours when she wasn't actively cooking, read through the copies of the land documents that Caleb had left on the kitchen table 2 evenings earlier. Not because he'd asked her to. Because they were there, and she was curious, and she'd learned a long time ago that looking at things directly was almost always better than avoiding them. The grant documents were dense and formal in the way of territorial paperwork, lots of language whose specific meaning was constructed more by context and convention than by the plain meaning of the words. She read through them twice, slowly with a pencil in her hand, making small marks in the margin, not on the documents themselves, which she had the sense to leave unmarked, but on a separate sheet of paper where she wrote down the things she didn't understand and the things she noticed. One thing she noticed was a reference, partway through the grant confirmation document, to a permanent landmark on the northwestern boundary, used to establish the corner point of the survey. It was described in the archaic surveying language of 1859, but the description a natural formation of divided stone, bifurcated by geological fracture, located at the headwater tributary was clear enough, the split stone. It was in the original grant document, placed there by Thomas Mercer's surveyor 28 years ago, as the fixed reference point for the entire western boundary, which meant if Garrett's independent survey established that the fence line ran correctly from the split stone, and the split stone itself was in the original grant document as the reference point, then Hargrove's surveyor had to be doing one of two things, either measuring from a different starting point, or claiming the stone itself was in a different location. Neither of those things was sustainable once you had the original document, an independent surveyor confirming the stone's position, and a witness who'd been present at the original filing. She thought about this for a long time. Then she went and knocked on the door of Caleb's office. He looked up from the desk. She set her sheet of notes in front of him and said, "Read this. Then tell me if I'm wrong." He read it. She stood and waited, not sitting, because the chair across from his desk felt at that moment like the wrong posture she needed to be standing, ready to think through the next step, not settled. He looked up. "You're not wrong," he said. "Then Dressler needs to know about the language in the grant document. It makes the split stone a legal anchor point, not just a physical landmark. Hargrove's survey is either measuring from the wrong place or misrepresenting where the stone is. Dressler's coming Thursday." "Good," she picked up her notes. "Tell him we need a photographer too." He looked at her. "To document the stone's exact location, with the fence line visible in the image, something that can be put in front of a court that can't be argued with by a different surveyor with different numbers." Caleb sat back in his chair slowly. He was looking at her with the expression she'd come to think of as the recalculating one, the one that meant he was revising something, quietly, and filing the revision away. "You found all of this reading the documents on the kitchen table," he said. "I cook better when I have something to think about," she said. Garrett delivered his findings on Thursday morning, sitting across from Caleb and Dressler at the main table, with his maps unrolled, and waited at the corners with coffee cups. Evelyn was in the kitchen. She could hear the conversation through the wall, not every word, but the shape of it, the rise and fall of technical language, and the occasional silence that meant someone was looking at something carefully. Miles was beside her, stirring something, also listening. "Can you hear them?" he asked in a low voice. "Pieces," she said. "Is it good? Give it time." 20 minutes into the meeting, she heard Caleb's voice change. Not loud, he was never loud, but a different quality entered it. Something that had been compressed and contained for weeks began to expand slightly. She sent Miles in with fresh coffee and a plate of biscuits, which was both hospitality and intelligence gathering. He came back 2 minutes later. "Garrett says Hargrove's surveyor started his measurement from a fence post," Miles said, his voice barely above a whisper. "A fence post that wasn't there in 1859. He measured from a constructed landmark, not the natural one, the split stone." Dressler said something about the grant document, and Caleb showed him your notes. She said nothing. She kept stirring. Dressler said. Miles paused, working to remember the exact words. He said it was a significant finding. He said the kind of thing that meant the split stone was legally binding as the boundary reference. In Hargrove's survey he searched for the word. Constructed. Fabricated, she said. Yeah, that. She allowed herself one moment of something that might have been satisfaction, and then she moved past it, because the practical part of her mind knew that a fabricated survey still needed to be disproven in front of a territorial court, and that Hargrove was not going to accept this quietly. The photographer, she said. Did Dressler say anything about the photographer? He's bringing one, Miles said. From Helena, he said. Miles stood very straight. He said it was a good idea. She turned back to the stove. The photographs were taken the following week, on a morning when the light was clean and the wind had dropped enough for the image to come out right. Garrett stood at the split stone with his measuring equipment, while the photographer set up his apparatus at 2 different positions, and Caleb stood just out of frame. Evelyn had suggested that he not be in the photographs, because a man standing next to his own landmark in his own photograph could be argued to have influenced the documentation. The photograph should be of the stone and the fence line and the surveyor's equipment. Objective. Indisputable. She'd told Caleb this the evening before. He'd looked at her for a moment and then said quietly, "How do you know these things?" "I don't," she said. "I just think about what someone on the other side would try to argue, and then I try to take away the argument before they make it." "Where did you learn that?" She thought about it. "Everywhere I've worked," she said. "When you're in a position where people are looking for reasons to dismiss you, you learn to think 10 steps ahead. You think, what are they going to say next? And what do I have ready when they say it?" He was quiet for a long moment. "That's a hard way to have to live," he said. "Yes," she said, "it is." She hadn't expected him to say that. She'd expected him to nod and move on to the next practical item. The directness of it, the acknowledgement, without qualification, did something to her composure that she had to work for a moment to recover. She turned back to what she'd been doing, and he didn't push it further, and that was the right thing too. On the Saturday before Dressler was to formally respond to the territorial complaint, Gideon Cole came to the kitchen at an unusual hour mid-afternoon, between meals, when the kitchen was technically hers and she was in it alone. Miles was out in the paddock doing something with Pete and a fence post. Caleb was in town. Gideon knocked on the kitchen doorframe, which he had never done before. He had always either walked in or stood in the doorway and talked from there. The knock was significant, and they both knew it. "Come in," she said. He came in and stood in the middle of the kitchen, hat in his hands, which was also new. He was a man who treated his hat as an extension of his head and rarely removed it indoors. She waited. She'd learned that Gideon Cole got to things at his own pace, and trying to hurry him made it worse. "I owe you something," he said finally. "You don't owe me anything, Gideon. I was hard on you when you came here." "You were uncertain about me," she said. "That's different. I said things I shouldn't have said." She looked at him steadily. He was not a man who apologized easily. She'd known that from the beginning. Persons those way you know something about a person from the quality of their silence more than from anything they say. This was costing him something, and she wasn't going to make it cost him more by being soft about it, when what it needed was to be received directly. "All right," she said. "I was wrong about you, all right." He stopped. He turned the hat in his hands once. "Whatever Hargrove does next, I'm going to be in the front of it. I want you to know that. I want Caleb to know it. This ranch is worth defending," and he stopped again. "You've done more for this place than most people who've been here years." She didn't say anything for a moment. She thought about the first morning he'd come to the kitchen and told her the coffee wasn't ready, and the flatness of the biscuits he claimed he could see through an oven door, and all the small acts of friction that she'd understood, even then, were really grief wearing a different coat. "Margaret would have liked you," she said, "I think. From what I've heard of her." Gideon went very still. "She was a practical woman," Evelyn said. "From what Roy's told me. She got things done without making a performance of it. She kept this place alive when it needed keeping alive." She paused. "I'm not her. I'm not trying to be her. But I think she'd have recognized what you're all trying to hold on to here." He was quiet for a long time. "She would have given you a hard time about the biscuits, too," he said finally. His voice was rougher than usual. "She was particular about biscuits. I'll take that as a compliment." He put his hat back on. "I'll let you get back to it," he said. "Gideon." He stopped. "The apple cake on the shelf. Take it for the bunkhouse." He looked at the shelf where she'd left one of the apple cakes from a batch she'd made that morning. "That's supper, so I'll make more. Take it." He took it. He went out without saying anything else, and she turned back to the stove, and she stood there for a moment with her eyes doing something inconvenient that she addressed by blinking several times and getting back to work. The formal response to Hargrove's boundary complaint went to the Territorial Land Office on Wednesday. Dressler had put together a packet that included Garrett's independent survey, the photographs of the split stone with surveying equipment at reference position, and a legal brief that Evelyn had not read, but that Caleb described to her as comprehensive and confident. The confidence, she suspected, was partly Dressler, and partly the fact that they now had something Hargrove had not anticipated, an original grant document with the split stone specifically named as the legal reference point, and a man named Walter Briggs, who had been there the day it was filed, and was willing to sit in front of a lawyer and say so. She'd talked to Walter again the week before. He'd come to the kitchen slowly, with the careful navigation of a man managing a body that had opinions about stairs, and she'd given him coffee and a slice of bread, and they'd sat at the table and gone through what he remembered, she asking questions and him answering, both of them aware that they were essentially preparing testimony and treating it accordingly. He remembered more than he'd initially indicated. Not just the presence of the official and the stamping of the papers, but specific details, the color of the ink in the record book, the location of the office relative to the street outside, the way Aldrich had asked Thomas Mercer to repeat his name for the record because he'd written it down wrong the first time. These were not the memories of a man who'd been present for something scandalous or irregular. They were the memories of a man who'd witnessed a completely ordinary bureaucratic transaction on an ordinary day, and that ordinariness was itself the point. Dressler had come to speak with Walter for 2 hours. When he'd left, he'd stopped in the kitchen doorway to say something to Evelyn that he said briskly, as a man says something when he's decided it and doesn't want to make a great production of it. "The Briggs testimony is solid," he said, "and your identification of the split stone language in the grant document, that was the piece I was missing. I'd read those documents 3 times and didn't catch it. I was looking for it," she said. "You were reading for what you expected to find." He looked at her with the expression of a man encountering something he hadn't categorized yet. "How long have you been a cook?" he said. "All my life," she said. He nodded and went out, and she decided she liked Dressler. The answer from the Territorial Land Office came on a Friday afternoon. Roy brought it in from town, riding faster than he usually rode, which was itself information before anyone opened anything. Caleb opened the letter in the yard, standing in the late afternoon light, and the men gathered around him in the loose sway of people who've learned to read a man's posture before his words. Evelyn stood at the kitchen window. Miles stood beside her. She watched Caleb read it once. Then he looked up. "Well?" Gideon said. "The office has formally requested Hargrove provide additional evidence for his surveyor's starting point reference," Caleb said. "They've received our documentation and they're requesting a formal response from Hargrove within 30 days. He folded the letter. "They've also noted that the original grant document establishes the split stone as the legal boundary reference, and that any survey not starting from that reference will require substantial justification." Silence in the yard, then Pete said, "That's good." "It's not finished," Caleb said. "Hargrove's got 30 days to respond, and he'll use them." "But it's good," Pete said again. "It's a step," Caleb said. Evelyn turned from the window and went back to the stove. She heard the men dispersing, the low sound of conversation, and then Miles was beside her again, with the particular brightness in his eyes that she'd come to think of as his real expression, the one underneath the careful, watchful thing he wore most of the time. "We're going to win," he said. "Maybe," she said. "Don't count things before they're finished." "But it's good. It's a step," she said, using Caleb's word. "Now go wash up," he went, still bright, still almost smiling. She watched him go and thought about a boy who had arrived at this ranch with no one and nothing, and had spent 4 years learning how to take up a space carefully. And she thought about how he'd been different these past weeks, less careful, less watchful, more willing to take the space he'd been offered. She thought she might have had something to do with that. She hoped she had. The thing she hadn't anticipated was what Hargrove would do in the 24 hours immediately following the Territorial Office's letter. She found out the way she found out most things that happened outside the ranch's visible life, from Miles, who heard it from Pete, who'd been in town the following morning. Hargrove had been at the hotel in Raven Creek the previous evening. He'd had dinner with 3 men, 2 of them local businessmen, one of them a man nobody recognized, and the conversation at the table had been audible enough to nearby diners that its general content had circulated through the town by morning. He'd said, specifically and within earshot of people he knew would repeat it, that Caleb Mercer had obtained his favorable response from the Territorial Office through improper influence, that the letter was not what it appeared to be, that the documentation Caleb had submitted had been prepared by a woman with no legal standing, no credentials, and no business involving herself in a territorial land matter. He'd called her, according to Pete's report, a woman of no particular account who had made herself Mercer's instrument. He had not said the same word Mrs. Alderton had used. He was too careful for that. But the implication sat beneath his language like something dead beneath still water, giving everything above it a particular quality. Evelyn listened to Miles telling her this, and she kept her face steady and her hands busy, and she did not say anything for the full 2 minutes it took him to finish. Then she said, "Where is Caleb, barn?" She untied her apron, hung it on the hook, and went out. Caleb was where Miles had said, doing something with a length of harness in the dim interior of the barn. He looked up when she came in, and he read her face in the way he'd gotten better at doing. "What happened?" he said. She told him, plainly and completely the way she'd told him about Mrs. Alderton. She watched him while she spoke, and she watched the same sequence of things move through his expression, the flash of anger, the compression of it, and then underneath, something colder and more deliberate. When she finished, he set the harness down. "He's trying to undermine the documentation," Caleb said. "He's trying to make me the issue instead of the evidence," she said. "If he can make people focus on who found the language in the grant document instead of what the language says, then the documentation stops being about the facts and starts being about me, and then he controls the argument." Caleb looked at her for a long moment. "What do you want to do?" he said. And the fact that he asked it that way, not "what should we do?" Not "what does Dressler say?" but "what do you want?" did something to her that she filed away for later examination. "I want to write a statement," she said, to Dressler, detailing exactly what I read in the grant documents, what I noticed, and what I brought to Caleb. Plain language, dated, signed, so that there's a record of what I actually did and how, and if Hargrove tries to misrepresent it in court, there's something in writing that says otherwise. Caleb nodded slowly. "And I want Garrett to put in his own statement confirming that the grant language identifying the split stone is standard surveying practice, that it's not some obscure finding that required legal expertise to identify, that any reasonably careful reader of the document could have found it. Taken the specialness out of it," Caleb said. "Taken the handle away from him," she said. "He wants to make it look like I inserted myself into something I had no business touching. Garrett's saying it was plain language visible to any reader makes that argument fall apart." Caleb was quiet. "Dressler's going to say you've got good instincts," he said. "Dressler can say whatever he likes as long as he files the statements," she said. And then Caleb did something he had never done before in the 6 weeks she'd been at Raven Creek Ranch. He reached out and put his hand briefly on her shoulder, just for a second, just the weight of it, and then he stepped back and picked up the harness again and said, "I'll write to Dressler tonight." She walked back to the kitchen. She stood at the work table and pressed her hands flat against it and felt the solid, slightly warped wood surface under her palms, and she thought about the fact that she had arrived at this place with $4.30 and the specific, accumulated weight of every door that had ever been shut in her face, and she thought about how strange it was that the thing she'd been running from, the being too much, the being wrong without having done anything wrong, had followed her here too. But here, for the first time, she wasn't running from it alone. She pushed off the work table, rolled her sleeves back, and started on the supper she still needed to make, because the Sens still needed to eat, and the work of feeding people didn't pause for land disputes or rumors or the complicated business of figuring out what you meant to a man who kept everything important behind a closed door. The stove was hot. The kitchen smelled like bread. She got back to work. Hargrove's 30 days ran out on a Tuesday. Evelyn knew the date because she'd been counting, not obsessively but steadily, the way you track weather when you know a storm is on its way, and the only question is what form it takes when it arrives. She'd marked nothing on paper. She'd simply known. And when Caleb came in from town that Tuesday evening with a particular set to his jaw that she'd learned to read, as a man carrying weight he hadn't yet put down, she dried her hands and waited. He sat at the kitchen table. Miles was already in bed. The men were in the bunkhouse. The kitchen was quiet in the particular way it got late in the evening, when the day's heat was still on the walls, and the lamp made everything amber and close. "Hargrove responded," Caleb said. She sat down across from him. "He didn't answer the boundary complaint directly," Caleb said. "He withdrew it." She looked at him. "He withdrew it. Dropped the boundary claim entirely." Caleb set his hat on the table. "Dressler says it means he knew it was going to fail. The split stone documentation was too solid. He cut his losses before the territorial office ruled against him officially." She waited, because the way Caleb was sitting told her that the withdrawal was not the end of what he had to say. "He filed something else," Caleb said. "The same day he withdrew the boundary claim. A separate filing with the territorial court." He paused. "He's challenging the original land grant. He's arguing that Thomas Mercer's 1,859 filing was fraudulent, that the official who processed it, Paul Aldrich, didn't have proper authority to issue the grant, and that the grant is therefore void." The word hung in the kitchen air. "Void? If the grant is void," Evelyn said carefully, "there's no ranch." "There's no ranch," Caleb confirmed. "No deed, no title, no legal claim to any of it. 11 years of work, 30 years of my family's history on this land. Gone." She sat with that. She made herself sit with it completely, feel the full weight of it, because she'd found that the only way to think clearly about something terrible was to stop trying to manage how terrible it was. "What does Dressler say?" she asked. "He says it's a serious challenge. More serious than the boundary dispute." Caleb's voice was level, but under it was something she recognized, the sound of a man who has been frightened and is refusing to let the fear make his decisions for him. "He says the fraudulent grant argument is difficult because it requires disproving a negative. Hargrove doesn't have to prove the grant was fraudulent. He just has to raise enough doubt about Aldrich's authority that a court can't be certain the grant was valid." "And Aldrich?" "Dead. Died in 1871. His records were partially destroyed in a fire at the Territorial Archive in 1874. She felt the shape of it, then the shape of what Hargrove had done. He hadn't found a weakness in Caleb's documentation and attacked it. He had found the place where the documentation was thinnest by pure circumstance, where a dead man and a burned archive left a gap, and he had put his argument precisely in that gap. It was, she thought, very well done. She hated him for it, and she could still see that it was well done. "Walter Briggs," she said. "Walter can testify he was there." But Walter wasn't inside the office. He held the horses. He saw Thomas Mercer go in and come out with papers. "He can't speak to whether Aldrich had proper authority at the time. Then we need to find out whether Aldrich had proper authority, independently. Dressler's working on it. Aldrich's appointment record should be in the territorial governor's files from that period. But those files are in Helena and it takes time." Caleb pressed his hands flat on the table. "The hearing is in 6 weeks. 6 weeks," she looked at him across the table. He was 33 years old and he had the face of a man 10 years older. Not because he'd lived badly, but because he'd lived fully every year of managing this ranch, visible in the way he held himself, the way he thought before he spoke, the way he understood that some things can't be hurried, no matter how much you need them to be. "Then we use the 6 weeks, she said. "Evelyn, don't tell me it's not my problem," she said. "We're past that." He looked at her. "We were past it before the gathering," she said. "Maybe before that. This is my kitchen, and those are my men eating at that table every night, and Miles is—" She stopped. "This is my ranch, too. Not on any paper, but in the way that matters. So don't tell me it's not my problem." The kitchen was very quiet. "All right," he said. His voice had a quality she hadn't heard in it before. Something stripped of its usual composure, just briefly, before it reassembled. "Then we used the 6 weeks. She started the following morning. What she started was not anything dramatic, no grand strategy announced, no declaration of intentions. She simply began in the early hours before breakfast to think systematically about everything she knew about Paul Aldrich. She knew his name from Walter, his rough physical description, from Walter's memory of a man behind a desk on an ordinary afternoon in 1859, the location of his office, the fact of his death in 1871, and one other thing, a thing she'd noticed when she'd read the grant documents and written her notes on the separate sheet of paper, and which she hadn't mentioned to anyone because at the time it had seemed like a minor detail. In the grant confirmation document, Aldrich's signature was accompanied by a title, not just his name, but a designation, Deputy Territorial Land Commissioner, acting appointment, by authority of the Territorial Governor's Office. Acting appointment. It was one of those phrases that either meant everything or nothing depending on context. An acting appointment could mean a man filling a role legitimately while a permanent appointment was processed. Or it could mean a man filling a role on a provisional basis that required subsequent confirmation to become permanent. If Aldrich's acting appointment had never been formally confirmed, if it had lapsed or been superseded, then the authority of his decisions during that acting period could potentially be questioned. But that was Hargrove's argument, the one she needed to defeat. The way to defeat it was to establish that acting appointments in the Territorial Land Office in 1859 were standard practice and legally binding without separate confirmation, which meant finding documentation of other acting appointments from the same period and the same office, and showing that their decisions had never been challenged and had been accepted as valid throughout the intervening decades. This was not a small research task. She knew that. She also knew that she had a better mind for this kind of thing than almost anyone would expect, because she'd spent 25 years being underestimated by people who saw the surface of her and stopped there. And underneath that surface, she'd been reading everything she could get her hands on, since she was a child in a house that had 2 books, and a mother who made her read them both until she could recite them. And she'd spent years in kitchens where the hours before service were quiet, and she'd read whatever was available. And she'd developed, without any formal name for it, the habit of making connections between things. She wrote a letter to Dressler that morning before breakfast. She told him about the acting appointment notation and what she thought it meant for Hargrove's argument and what evidence would be needed to counter it. She told him to look in the territorial governor's correspondence from 1858 and 1859 for other acting appointments to the land office, and to check whether those appointments had generated any legal challenges in the years following. She folded the letter and gave it to Miles to take to town with the supply list. Then she made breakfast for 12 men and did not mention any of it to anyone. Dressler's response came 4 days later, and it was for a lawyer who communicated in careful and measured language, almost excited. He had found in the territorial governor's files a record of 6 acting appointments to the land office during the period 1857 to 1862. Paul Aldrich was one of them. Every one of those 6 acting appointments had issued land grants. Not a single one of those grants had ever been challenged on the basis of the acting appointment's authority. Several of them had been subsequently litigated for entirely different reasons: boundary disputes, inheritance conflicts, and in every case the courts had treated the original grant as valid, never once questioning whether the official who issued it had proper authority. This established, Dressler wrote, a clear pattern of legal acceptance. Acting appointments to the territorial land office were treated as carrying full legal authority. Any argument that Aldrich lacked authority would have to overcome 27 years of contrary legal practice. He also wrote, in the second paragraph of the letter, that the line of inquiry had been, and here Evelyn could almost hear him choosing his words with the deliberateness of a man who didn't give compliments lightly unusually productive, and that he was grateful for the direction. She read the letter twice, and then went and knocked on Caleb's office door. He read it. He looked up. "You wrote to him about the acting appointment before you told me," he said. "I wasn't sure it would lead anywhere," she said. "I didn't want to give you something to hope for that turned out to be nothing." He held the letter. "It's not nothing, no. But it's still not enough on its own. We need Walter's testimony to hold, and we need someone who can speak to Aldrich's conduct in the office generally, whether there were complaints about his decisions at the time, whether anything he did was ever contested. That's," Caleb thought, "that's a lot to find in 6 weeks, 5 weeks now," she said. He almost smiled. It was the closest he got on most days, that almost, and she'd stopped waiting for it to become something more, and had simply started accepting it as what it was. "I'll write to Dressler about the conduct question," he said. "Tell him to look at the territorial legislature records from 1860 to 1865, she said. "If there were complaints about Aldrich's appointments, they'd have come up in committee. Someone would have put it in writing." He was already reaching for his pen. She went back to the kitchen. The 5 weeks before the hearing had a quality of compressed time each day, full and fast, in a way that meant she fell into bed each night genuinely tired. Not the anxious sleeplessness of someone waiting for something, but the clean exhaustion of someone who had worked hard and done what they could. The men felt it. The ranch had taken on a quality she hadn't seen before she arrived: a cohesion, a sense of common purpose, and it expressed itself in small ways that she only noticed in aggregate. Gideon started organizing the morning work assignments before Caleb had to ask him to, freeing Caleb for the legal preparation. Pete and 2 of the other younger hands voluntarily stayed close to the ranch's boundaries during this period, a kind of informal patrol that nobody ordered and nobody named. Roy made 2 extra trips to town for supplies so that Miles didn't have to go as often, because Miles had been coming back from town with the strained look of a boy who'd been hearing things and trying not to show it. She talked to Roy about that quietly one morning when they were both early. "What are people saying?" she asked. Roy poured his coffee and considered. Roy's consideration was worth waiting for. He was a man who didn't speak until he knew what he meant to say. "Divided," he said. "Hargrove has money and he's been spending it on the right conversations. But the gathering helped. Mrs. Holt has been," he paused, "vocal in our favor. In the direction of fairness," Roy said, which was, she suspected, more than Mrs. Holt would have wanted said about her. And there are people who remember Thomas Mercer, who don't like the idea of a dead man's reputation being pulled through a court by someone who bought his way into this valley. That's something. "It's not a vote," Roy said. "Public opinion doesn't decide a territorial court." "No," she said. "But it decides who Hargrove has to have dinner with afterward. And men who care about that kind of thing will sometimes make choices they wouldn't otherwise make." Roy drank his coffee. "You think Hargrove cares what people think of him?" "I think he cares what useful people think of him," she said. "Otherwise he wouldn't have had that dinner at the hotel where everyone could hear him." Roy looked at her with the expression she was getting good at reading it, across many faces, the particular expression of someone revising a category. "You're going to be all right here," he said. "Whatever happens with Hargrove, you're going to be all right." She didn't know quite what to say to that, so she refilled his coffee and went back to the stove. It was in the 3rd week before the hearing that Walter Briggs came to find her. Not to the kitchen, she was in the yard, bringing in a basket of laundry she'd hung that morning. The kind of task she'd do between the serious cooking hours when her hands needed something simple. He was moving better than he had been. The weather had warmed, and his back had apparently agreed to cooperate with that. "I remembered something," he said. She set the basket down. "About Aldrich?" "About what came after." He looked out toward the western fence line, the habit of men who think better when they're looking at distance. There was a dispute. Not about land, about timber. The year after Mercer filed, a man called Creevy tried to claim timber rights on the north slope of the Henderson Range. He said Aldrich didn't have the authority to issue the timber permits that contradicted his claim. She was very still. "What happened?" she said. "The territorial court dismissed it. Ruled that Aldrich's authority was properly constituted and his permits were valid. I remembered it because Thomas Mercer talked about it. He was watching it, worried it might affect the land grant. But the court ruled in favor of the permits and Thomas relaxed." Walter looked back at her. There'd be a record of that ruling. A court ruling that specifically addressed Aldrich's authority. A court ruling from 1860. Specifically ruling on whether Paul Aldrich had proper authority to issue decisions from the Territorial Land Office. If that ruling existed, and Walter said it did, said it with the certainty of a man recalling not just the fact, but the relief of an older man he'd respected hearing that the thing he'd feared wasn't coming, then Hargrove's entire challenge collapsed. You couldn't walk into a territorial court in 9887 and argue that an official lacked authority when another territorial court had already ruled, in 9860, that he had it. She picked up the laundry basket. "Walter," she said, "I need you to write down what you just told me. Every detail. The name Creevy, the timber rights, the year. The fact that Thomas Mercer discussed it. Put it on paper and sign it." "I'm not much for writing," he said. I'll write it. You tell me and I'll write it and you can read it back and correct anything that's wrong and then sign it." He looked at her. "You think it matters?" "I think it might be the most important thing that's happened in the last 5 weeks," she said. She wrote the statement that afternoon, sitting at the kitchen table, while Miles made bread under her intermittent supervision, a level of unsupervised trust she'd been extending to him gradually, watching his hands develop their own understanding of the dough. Walter sat across from her and talked slowly, and she wrote what he said. And when he was done, she read it back, and he made 3 small corrections, and then he signed it in the handwriting of a man who didn't write often, but whose signature was deliberate and firm. She sent it to Dressler by the morning's post, along with a note explaining what she believed they'd find if they searched the territorial court records for the Creevy case. Dressler found it in 4 days. The ruling was exactly as Walter had described, a territorial court decision from the spring of 1860, ruling in the Creevy timber dispute, explicitly affirming that Paul Aldrich's appointment to the Territorial Land Office carried full legal authority and that his official decisions were binding and valid. The court had been unequivocal. There had been no dissent. Dressler came to the ranch himself when he had it. He rode out on a Thursday afternoon and came through the gate and tied his horse at the rail and came into the kitchen without knocking, because the door was open, and he set the document on the kitchen table and said, "This is it." Evelyn dried her hands and looked at it. Caleb was behind Dressler, having come from the barn when he saw the lawyer's horse. "Hargrove's legal team has already seen our response on the acting appointment pattern," Dressler said. "We submitted it last week. But this," he tapped the ruling. "This is a direct court precedent. It doesn't leave room for argument. Aldrich had authority. The 1860 court said so. The grant was issued under valid authority. Everything Hargrove built his challenge on is standing on nothing." Caleb read the document. He read it slowly, which was how he read everything, and the kitchen was quiet. Then he set it down and he looked at Evelyn. She looked back at him. She didn't say anything, neither did he. But something passed between them in that look that was beyond the boundary of anything that had been said, before something that had been accumulating since the first morning he'd come into the kitchen, expecting it to be empty, and found her there, with the coffee hot, and had grown through every conversation at the table, and every evening on the porch, and every time she'd pushed something toward him that he needed, and hadn't known how to ask for. Dressler looked between them and had the good professional judgment to start talking about the hearing schedule. The hearing was 3 weeks out when Hargrove made his final move before it. Not a legal move, something else. He sent a man to the ranch, not himself, a man she didn't recognize, dressed plainly and riding a plain horse in the way of someone who'd been told to not look like what they were, which made them look exactly like what they were. The man came to the gate on a Wednesday morning and asked for Caleb Mercer, and Caleb went out to meet him in the yard, and Evelyn watched from the kitchen window, while Miles stood beside her and watched too. The man talked for several minutes. Caleb listened. Then Caleb said something brief, and the man nodded and rode back out through the gate. Caleb stood in the yard for a long moment after the man was gone. He was looking at the mountains, or at least in their direction, in the way he did when he was absorbing something and hadn't yet decided what to do with it. Then he came inside. The men were all at the table. It was mid-morning, just past the breakfast hours, and several of them had come in for coffee before going back out. Caleb came in and stood at the head of the table and said, without preamble, Hargrove's offering to drop the legal challenge. Silence at the table. All of it, Caleb said. The grant challenge, any future claims. He walks away from the whole thing. Pete said, what does he want? 40 acres, Caleb said, the northwest corner of the western pasture. The land along the creek. Nobody spoke for a moment. The creek, the water source for the western pasture through the dry months. The reason that pasture stayed productive when the range further east dried out by August. If you give him the creek, Gideon started. The western pasture becomes seasonal, Caleb said. We can graze it spring and early summer. After that, we're moving cattle that we can't support through the dry stretch. That's a quarter of our capacity, Roy said, quietly, factually. Maybe more, I know. He wants the creek on purpose, Gideon said. He knows exactly what he's asking for. He takes the creek and the pasture dies by degrees, and then in 3 years you're selling it to him anyway. I know, Caleb said. More silence. Then Evelyn said from the kitchen doorway, when does he need an answer? Every head turned. 1 week, Caleb said. Then don't answer today, she said. She came to the table and stood at the far end across from Caleb. She looked at the men, Gideon, Roy, Pete, Walter sitting carefully in his chair with his bad back against the rail, Miles at the edge of the group, listening with the focused attention of a boy who understood that what was being decided at this table concerned him as much as anyone. Hargrove is offering this because he's afraid of the hearing, she said. Not because he's generous. He's looked at what Dressler has, and he knows his challenge is in trouble. This offer is not a negotiation, it's a retreat dressed up to look like a compromise. Taking the offer is still better than losing the whole ranch, Pete said. He said it without hostility, just with the honesty of someone saying a thing that had to be said. Yes, she said. It is. If we lose the hearing, we lose everything. That's real. She looked at Caleb. But Dressler doesn't think we're going to lose. Dressler could be wrong, Caleb said. He could, she said. He's honest about that. He's a lawyer who's worked this territory for 20 years, and he thinks our position is strong. But courts are not certain things, she paused. This is your decision, yours and the men's. I'm not the one who built this ranch or who's going to be here in the years after. I'm telling you what I see, and what I see is a man making an offer because he thinks he's going to lose. What you do with that is up to you. She went back to the kitchen. She kept her back to the room and her hands on the work table, and she listened to the conversation behind her, the voices of men weighing something real, going back and forth across it, Gideon's voice and Roy's and Pete's, and the younger hands, and Caleb mostly listening and sometimes asking a question, the way he led from attention rather than from volume. Miles appeared at her elbow 20 minutes later. Caleb asked everyone to think on it for 2 days, he said quietly. Good, she said. What do you think he'll decide? She thought about a man who'd said he wasn't going to give this ranch to Victor Hargrove in a kitchen on an early morning when she'd been there 6 days and barely knew him. She thought about the way he'd said it not with bravado, just as a fact he'd already processed and filed. I think I know, she said. But it's his decision. Caleb told her that evening. Not the men, he'd tell the men tomorrow, and they probably already knew, or most of them did, but he told her first, which she noticed and tucked away without comment. He found her on the porch steps with a cup of coffee, the same spot where they'd sat after the gathering, and he sat beside her and he said, I'm refusing the offer. She nodded. I'm not going to give him the creek, he said. I'm not going to give him anything. If we lose the hearing, we'll face what comes. But I'm not going to make a deal with a man who's been trying to take this land by destroying my father's name. She drank her coffee. Dressler should know by tomorrow. I'll write to him tonight. He was quiet for a moment. You were right what you said this morning, about it being up to me and the men. But I want you to know your opinion matters to me. What you said about Hargrove being afraid, that wasn't nothing. That was the thing that settled it. She looked at him, in the dark in the lamplight from the window. I wasn't certain, she said honestly. I believe it. But I wasn't certain, neither am I, he said. But I'd rather make a wrong choice from an honest position than a right choice from a cowardly one. She thought about that for a long time. It was such a specific and unsentimental way of articulating something important that it stayed with her. The shape of it, the weight. Your father would have said something like that, she said. He was quiet. Then where did that come from? Walter talks about him sometimes, when we're working on his statements. He says Thomas Mercer was stubborn in a way that was almost inconvenient, but that it came from the same place his honesty came from. She paused. You're like him in that way. Caleb looked at the dark yard, the familiar shape of the barn and the fence line and the mountains beyond, the landscape of everything he'd been trying to hold on to. I don't know if that's enough to win a court case, he said. No, she said, that's what Dressler's for. He almost laughed. It was the closest he'd come to an actual laugh in all the weeks she'd known him, and it changed his face in a way that was briefly and completely unguarded, and she looked at it without looking away, because it seemed like the kind of thing you should actually see when it happens. Then it was gone, and he was quiet again, and they sat on the porch steps in the cooling evening with the sounds of the ranch around them. The hearing is in 3 weeks, he said. Then we have 3 weeks, she said. The final preparation was quieter than the weeks before it. There was nothing more to find, nothing more to build. Dressler had what he needed. Walter's testimony was prepared. The acting appointment pattern was documented. The Creevy ruling was filed. Garrett's independent survey was on record, and the photographs of the Splitstones sat in Dressler's office in Helena in a folder with a dated label. What remained was the waiting and the working and the ordinary life of the ranch, continuing underneath the weight of what was coming. Evelyn cooked. She taught Miles how to make a stew that didn't need much watching, one of the fundamental stews, the kind that rewards patience and punishes hurrying, that gets better the longer it goes. He was developing a real sense for it now, for the way things changed over time in the pot, the way you could tell by smell and sound, and the look of the surface whether something needed attention or just more time. She watched him at the stove and thought about what came next for him, not just the immediate next of whether Raven Creek Ranch survived the hearing, but the larger next. He was 12. In 6 years he'd be 18. In 10 years he'd be a man who could cook well enough to work anywhere, not just as a hired hand on a cattle ranch, but in a real kitchen if he wanted that, or wherever else his life took him. She hadn't said any of this to him. She wasn't sure it was the right time, but she thought about it. Gideon had become, without any formal transition, something like her deputy in the management of the ranch's daily life during this period. He organized the men's work with the efficiency of someone who'd been waiting for permission to take that responsibility, and had finally either gotten it or decided he didn't need to wait anymore. He came to her each morning and went over what needed doing that day, not asking for approval, but giving her information, the way colleagues exchange information, and she gave him what she knew about supplies and schedules, and he went and did it. One morning he said, simply and without context, "You've changed this place." She was at the stove and she didn't turn. The place was already here. "You know what I mean? I do," she said. "But the people were already here too. I just kept them fed." He was quiet for a moment, and then he went out. She heard him organizing the morning in the yard, his voice carrying the clean, particular authority of someone who has found the role that fits him and is operating in it without apology. She thought about that all morning, intermittently, about how a place changes not when someone extraordinary arrives and transforms it by force of personality, but when the right conditions are created for the people already in it to become what they were capable of being. She had made conditions. She had kept the coffee hot, and the lamp burning, and the kitchen stocked, and the table full, and had demanded that the kitchen be treated as a place worth treating well. She had listened when listening was what was needed, and spoken when speaking was what was needed, and had been wrong sometimes, and had not hidden that. She was not Margaret Mercer. She had never tried to be. But she thought Margaret Mercer, from what Walter and Roy and Gideon had told her in pieces, had understood the same thing, that a household is not a building, it's a practice. You practice it every day, and some days you do it better and some days you do it worse. And it is never finished, and it is never perfect, and it matters enormously. 3 days before the hearing, Caleb came to the kitchen in the evening and stood in the doorway and looked at her in a way that was different from his usual looking. "What?" she said. "Nothing," he said. "I was just stopped." She waited. "I wanted to say something before the hearing," he said, "in case I just wanted to say it." She turned fully to face him. "Whatever happens," he said, "you staying here. What you've done for this ranch, for Miles, for all of us." He stopped again. He was not a man whose words came easily when the feelings were real ones, and she had long since stopped wanting him to be someone else. "I'm grateful, and I think you know there's more than that, but I'm not." He stopped a third time. "I'll say the rest after the hearing." She looked at him for a long moment. "After the hearing," she said. He nodded. She turned back to the stove. Her hands were not entirely steady when she picked up the spoon, which was not something she intended to let him see, and she was fairly certain she managed it, but she wasn't entirely sure. 3 days, the hearing was in 3 days. She kept stirring, and the kitchen held its warmth around her, and outside the window the Montana night was enormous and dark and full of what was coming. The morning Caleb left for Helena, Evelyn was up before him. She'd barely slept. Not from fear exactly, or not only from fear, but from the particular restlessness of someone who has done everything they can do and must now wait for other people to finish the work. She'd lain in the dark and gone through it all one more time. Dressler's documents, Walter's testimony, the Creevy ruling, the photographs, Garrett's survey. She'd turned each piece over in her mind the way you check a stove before you leave a kitchen, making sure everything is where it should be, making sure nothing has been left unattended. Everything was where it should be. She knew that. It didn't stop her from checking. She was at the stove when Caleb came through, dressed for travel, his good coat over his arm, his hat in his hand. He stopped when he saw her, the same way he'd stopped on the first morning he'd come into the kitchen, expecting emptiness, and found her there. It had become, in the months since, a kind of recurring thing between them, him walking into a room expecting one thing and finding her, and the small recalibration that followed. She'd made biscuits and bacon and strong coffee, and she put a plate in front of him without asking if he wanted it, because he was leaving at first light for a 2-day ride and a court hearing, and of course he needed to eat. He sat, he ate. She stood at the stove with her own coffee. "Dressler's meeting me in Helena tonight," he said. "I know. Walter rode up yesterday. He'll be there." "I know that too." He looked at her across the kitchen. Lamp still burning. It was that dark hour before dawn when the outside world hasn't committed to the day yet, and the kitchen light is the only thing that feels real. "You should be there," he said. It came out like a fact, not a sentiment. Just something he'd concluded. "There's 12 men and a boy who need feeding," she said. "They can manage 2 days they cannot," she said. "Pete burned water last month trying to boil an egg. I saw it happen." Something moved at the corners of his mouth. "I'll be here when you get back," she said. "That's where I'm useful right now." He was quiet for a moment, looking at his plate, and then he looked up and said, "I meant what I said the other night. I'll say the rest when I get back." "I know," she said. "You're not going to tell me what the rest is?" "No," she said. "You'll tell me when you tell me." He finished his breakfast. He stood and put his coat on and his hat, and he stopped at the kitchen doorway on his way out, the same doorway he'd stood in on the first night when he'd offered her the job, when she'd been washing pots and waiting to find out if her life was going to change. "Evelyn." She looked at him. "Thank you," he said. For all of it, he went out. She heard his boots as on the porch, the step down into the yard, the sound of the horse being brought from the stable by Gideon, who'd also been up before dawn, because that was the kind of man Gideon had turned out to be underneath all the friction and the grief. She stood at the window and watched Caleb ride out through the gate in the gray pre-morning light, and she kept watching until the road bent and he was gone, and then she turned back to the stove and started the bread for the day. The 2 days Caleb was gone were the longest Evelyn had spent at Raven Creek, and they were also, in a strange way, clarifying. Without the constant low-grade tension of Caleb's presence, the way she'd grown attuned to his moods, his silences, the way he held his jaw when something was weighing on him, she could feel more clearly what the ranch had become. Not what it had been when she arrived, that working outfit held together by competence and stubbornness and very little else. Something different, something with more give in it. More warmth, which was a word she'd been cautious about using, because warmth can go sentimental if you're not careful, but it was the right word. Gideon managed the work with the quiet authority that had emerged over the past months. He came to her in the mornings, and they went over the day's requirements, and then he went and did them, and the men followed his lead with the ease of people who've stopped needing to be convinced. Miles worked beside her in the kitchen in the mornings and went out with Pete in the afternoons, which was a new development that she'd encouraged. Because Miles at 12 needed the outdoor time, needed to learn the ranch beyond the kitchen, needed to understand what he was part of. On the first evening, with supper done and the men at the table, talking in the loose way they did now, not the compressed silence of the early days, but actual conversation, stories and jokes and arguments about cattle decisions that had happened 3 years ago and were apparently still being relitigated, she sat in the kitchen alone and thought about something she'd been turning over for a while. She thought about the woman who'd been turned away from every door in Raven Creek with $4.30 in her pocket and worn boots and no particular reason to believe the next door would be different. She thought about the 14 miles she'd walked because there was nothing left but to walk them. She thought about standing in this kitchen for the first time and looking at the cracked stove and the bare shelves and the warped work table and making the decision, the quiet, private, uncelebrated decision to make the best meal she could with what was in front of her. People talk about turning points as if they're dramatic, as if there's a moment of clarity that descends and everything shifts. In Evelyn's experience, turning points were almost always embarrassingly practical. You walk 14 miles, you light a fire in a broken stove. You make cornbread with flour that's 3 months old. You keep the lamp burning. You do it again the next day and the day after that. And at some point you look around and realize the accumulation of those ordinary acts has built something that didn't exist before. She didn't think she was remarkable. She thought she was stubborn and competent, and had grown up hard enough that she'd stopped expecting softness from the world, and had therefore been in a position to be genuinely surprised when she found it. That was worth something, she thought. Not knowing what you are, not some confident self-assessment, just the accumulated doing of what you can with what you have, and the willingness to stay in a place long enough to find out what it's becoming. Miles appeared in the doorway. "You're not eating," he said. "I ate earlier." "You didn't." He came in and sat across from her at the table, which he did now without asking, the easy inhabiting of a space that he'd taken months to arrive at. "Are you worried about the hearing?" "Yes," she said, because it was Miles, and she didn't see the point of performing calm she didn't have. "Dressler's good," he said. He said it with the particular confidence of a 12-year-old who has decided something and doesn't entertain alternatives. "He is," she said. "And we found everything." "You found everything." "We found it," she said. "All of us." He looked at her with the serious dark eyes that had been watching her since the first evening she'd arrived and sent him to stir the apples. "When Caleb gets back," he said carefully in the tone of someone approaching something sideways, "is it going to be different?" She looked at him. "He said he had more to say," Miles said. "After the hearing, I heard him. I wasn't trying to, I was just in the hallway." She thought about how to answer that. She thought about what he was actually asking, which was not really about what Caleb would say. It was about what came after that, whether the thing that had been building for months would resolve into something that changed the shape of his life again, the way it had changed when Caleb had taken him in, the way it had changed when Evelyn had arrived. "I don't know exactly what's going to happen," she said, "but I'm not going anywhere. Whatever happens after the hearing, I'm not going anywhere." He nodded. He seemed to accept this the way he accepted most things she told him, not blindly, but with the specific trust of someone who has cataloged enough instances of a person being honest with them to extend a provisional faith. "Go to bed," she said. "We've got a lot of bread to make tomorrow." He went. She stayed at the table a little longer, listening to the ranch settle into its nighttime sounds, and she let herself feel just for a few minutes, in the privacy of the empty kitchen, the full weight of what was at stake 2 days' ride away in a territorial courtroom. Then she got up, checked the stove, turned down the lamp, and went to bed. The letter came on the afternoon of the second day. She knew it was from Dressler before Roy handed it to her, because Roy was holding it with the careful both hands grip of someone transporting something significant, and because his face, which was not an expressive face, was doing something. It rarely did something that was either the early stages of relief or the early stages of grief, and she couldn't tell which from 15 feet. She took it. She went to the kitchen table. She sat down. Miles was at the stove, and he turned and watched her. "Read it," he said. She opened it. Dressler's handwriting was small and precise, the handwriting of a man who wrote a great deal and had learned efficiency. She read the first paragraph once. Then she set the letter flat on the table and pressed her hands over it and breathed. "Evelyn," Miles said. "The territorial court has dismissed Hargrove's claim," she said. "The ruling was handed down this morning. The court found that Paul Aldrich's appointment was fully constituted and legally binding, and that the land grant issued to Thomas Mercer in 1859 is valid, properly registered, and not subject to challenge." She stopped. Her voice had done something toward the end of that sentence that she hadn't authorized it to do. "Raven Creek Ranch belongs to Caleb." The court confirmed it. The kitchen was absolutely silent. Then Miles made a sound that was not a word, just a sound. The sound that comes out of a person when something they've been bracing against for a long time suddenly lifts, and the body doesn't immediately know what to do with the space where the weight was. He crossed the kitchen in 3 steps and put his arms around her, and she held on with both hands, her face against the top of his head, and neither of them said anything for a long moment. Then she let go and straightened, and Miles stepped back, and they both did the thing people do. When they've been closer to an emotion than they intended, they found something to look at, something to do with their hands. "Go tell Gideon," she said. "Tell all of them." He went at a run. She heard it happen through the walls and the windows, the sound of the news moving through the ranch. Gideon's voice, and then several voices at once, and then a whoop from Pete that she suspected could be heard from the road, and the sound of boots crossing the yard in multiple directions. She sat in the kitchen and read Dressler's letter again. The judge had been, Dressler wrote, unequivocal. The Creevy ruling from 1860 had been exactly as definitive as she'd hoped, a direct legal precedent establishing Aldrich's authority, one which Hargrove's legal team could not argue around without asking the court to overrule a prior territorial decision, which courts are deeply reluctant to do. Walter Briggs's testimony had been steady and credible. Garrett's survey had gone unchallenged. and the grant document itself, the language identifying the split stone, as the legal reference point had been read into the court record by Dressler, and had, he wrote, produced what he described as a visible shift in the room. Because it meant that Hargrove's challenge was not just legally insufficient, it was factually constructed on a misrepresentation. His surveyor had deliberately measured from a fence post instead of the natural landmark, because measuring from the natural landmark would have immediately shown his client's claim was false. The judge had noted this formally. In the ruling, she read that part twice. Then she put the letter down and looked at the kitchen around her, the stove that the blacksmith had properly fixed, the oven with its working hinge, the shelves that were fully stocked, the work table that she'd learned to work with rather than against, and the window with the view of the yard where she could see Gideon and Roy and Pete and the other men in a group, talking and gesturing and doing the things men do when they're trying to contain something they feel strongly. She thought about a cracked stoveplate and 3 months of bad flour, and a warped table, and a kitchen that had been waiting for someone to decide it was worth caring about. She thought about 14 miles of gravel road and $4.30. She thought about every door. Caleb rode in at dusk. She knew he was coming because Gideon had posted Pete on the road 2 hours earlier, which was not something any of them had discussed, and which Pete had done without being asked, because that was what this place had become, a place where people did the necessary thing without waiting to be told, because they'd developed the instinct for what the place needed. She heard Pete's horse first, the faster hoofbeats of someone riding back with news, and then the sounds of the yard changing, the men gathering. She stayed in the kitchen. She had supper on. She'd started it 3 hours earlier, the kind of meal that required genuine care, not because the occasion demanded it, but because she'd wanted to do something with her hands while she waited. She heard Caleb's voice in the yard. She heard Gideon's voice responding. She heard what passed between them, not the words, the shape of it, and then she heard the quality of the yard change, the way the sounds softened and spread out, men dispersing, the particular sound of a moment that is finished and is now becoming the next thing. Boots on the porch. Caleb came through the kitchen door and stopped. She was at the stove, her back to him, and she turned around. He looked different from when he'd left, not old or something else. Like a man who had been carrying something for so long that when it was finally taken from him, the first thing he felt was not relief but the disorienting absence of the weight. His shoulders weren't set the way they usually were. His jaw wasn't tight. He looked in a way she hadn't seen in the months she'd known him, like someone who might sleep tonight. Gideon told me, he said. Dressler's letter came this afternoon, she said. He came fully into the kitchen and set his hat on the table and stood there, looking at her. It's done, he said. It wasn't triumphant. It was the quiet of a man confirming to himself that something real had happened, that it wasn't something he'd get up in the morning to find had gone away. It's done, she said. He sat down at the table suddenly, the way a person sits when their legs have decided they've carried enough for one day. He pressed both hands flat on the tabletop and looked at them for a moment. Walter was remarkable, he said. Dressler said he answered every question without hesitating. No embellishment. Just what he knew. He knows what he saw, she said. It's straightforward when it's true. The judge cited the Creevy ruling, Caleb said. In the decision. By name, I know. Dressler wrote about it. Caleb looked up at her. You found that. You and Walter together. Walter remembered it. I just wrote it down and asked the right questions. He was quiet. He was looking at her with the open, unguarded quality that she'd only seen in flashes before, the quality that usually appeared, and then closed again, the door that was shut but not locked. It was not closed now. I told you I had more to say, he said. After the hearing, she waited. I'm not good at this, he said. I want to say that first, because I don't want you to think that what I say next is the whole of it, that the words are the full measure. They're not. The full measure is... He stopped. The full measure is 4 months of watching you, and I don't have language adequate to what I've watched. She didn't move. She kept her hands on the stove handle and let him find it. When Margaret died, he said, I stopped expecting certain things. Told myself it was sense. That you get one of something like that, and you don't go looking for a second one, because the looking is its own damage. He paused. And then you walked in through the gate, and I gave you a job, because the alternative was asking you to walk 14 miles back to town, and I couldn't do that. And I thought Cook's position. That's manageable. She almost smiled at that, almost. And it was manageable, he said, until about the 3rd week, and then it wasn't. And I've been living with that since the 3rd week. I know, she said. He looked at her. You know, Caleb, I've been living in this kitchen for 4 months. I know when a man comes through a door looking for something he won't name. He was quiet for a moment. Something shifted in his face, that unguarded quality deepening, and she thought, this is it. This is the thing underneath all the composure and the closed doors. This is just a man who has been very careful for a very long time and is now finally deciding to stop. I love you, he said. It was said simply, not dramatically. It had the weight of something that had been true for a long time and was now finally being acknowledged out loud rather than carried internally, where it had been getting heavier by degrees. She breathed. I love you too, she said. I have for a while. He looked at her across the kitchen, across the work table and the stove and the space between them, and she looked back, and neither of them moved for a moment, because sometimes the right thing is to let a thing be real for a moment before you do anything about it. Then he stood up. I want you to stay, he said, not as the cook, not as whatever I've been calling this to myself to make it manageable. I want you to stay as the person you are in this house, beside me. Because this ranch is better with you in it, and I am better with you in it, and Miles is— He stopped. Miles is becoming someone with you in his life, and I don't want to manage any of that from a distance anymore. She crossed the kitchen. She crossed it the way she'd walked 14 miles, not with hesitation, not with performance, just because it was where she was going. She took his hands. His hands were big and work-proof and warm, and he held hers with the carefulness of someone who is aware they are holding something they do not want to damage. Yes, she said. He exhaled. Just once, long and slow, the same kind of exhale she'd let out months ago when she'd learned she had a job. The exhale that carries 3 weeks or 3 years or a whole long weight of something out of the body. Yes, she said again, I'll stay. She told Miles the next morning. She'd thought about how to say it, whether there was a careful way, a way that prepared him adequately, a way that made room for whatever he felt about it. She'd gone back and forth on it while she made the biscuits, and by the time he came in at 6:30, sleepy-eyed and reaching for the coffee before he'd even sat down, she'd decided that the only way was the direct way. Caleb asked me to stay, she said, permanently. Not as the cook, as she paused, as the person who belongs here. Miles poured his coffee. He took a sip. He looked at the table. Okay, he said. She watched him. Okay, she said. He looked up. His eyes were doing the complicated thing they did when he was feeling something he didn't entirely have a name for. I heard you talking last night, he said. I wasn't. I went for water and you were in the kitchen. She waited. I've been here 4 years, he said, and Caleb is good. He's the best person I know. But, he stopped. He turned the cup on the table. He didn't know what to do with me exactly. He just knew he wasn't going to leave me somewhere bad. So he brought me here and gave me work and made sure I was fed and safe. And that's more than most people would do. Yes, she said. But you— He stopped again and she waited, because she understood that Miles at 12 was doing something genuinely difficult, which was trying to articulate an emotional truth with the limited vocabulary of a child who hadn't had many people to practice it with. You taught me things, not just cooking. You looked at me like I was going to become something, not like I was something to be managed. She sat down across from him. You are going to become something, she said. You already are. I know, he said. Which was, she thought, a remarkable thing for a 12-year-old to say, not with arrogance, but with the particular quiet confidence of someone who has recently been given permission to believe something about themselves and has accepted it. I'm glad you're staying, he said. That's all. I'm just glad. She reached across the table and put her hand over his briefly, and he didn't pull back. And then she stood up and went back to the biscuits, because the oven was ready and biscuits don't wait. 2 weeks after the hearing, Dressler sent a final letter. It contained, among the legal formalities and the closing documentation, one additional item, a note informing Caleb that Hargrove had, in the week following the court ruling, made quiet inquiries about selling 2 of the properties he'd acquired in the valley, the Kellerman place specifically and a smaller parcel east of the river. He was not, it appeared, leaving the territory. Men like Hargrove don't leave. They simply redistribute, but he was recalibrating. A man who had overextended toward a target that turned out to be more solid than he'd expected, pulling back to assess. Caleb read that part of the letter twice and then set it down and didn't discuss it further, which was, Evelyn thought, exactly right. Hargrove was not the point. He never had been. He'd been the pressure that revealed what Raven Creek was made of, and now that the pressure had eased, there was no need to keep looking at him. The ranch moved into the rhythms of late summer with the ease of a place that had resolved something and could now simply be itself. She noticed the ways it had changed, not dramatically, not all at once, but in the accumulated small ways that are actually how things change. The supper table was a different kind of place than it had been in the first week she'd arrived. Men stayed after meals now, talking, arguing, occasionally laughing at something that was actually funny, and not just the grim humor of exhausted people trying to get through a day. Roy had started telling stories. He had a talent for it that nobody had apparently known about, including possibly Roy, the quiet, compressed stories of a man who had been in many places and had retained what mattered. And the table listened the way people listen when they know they're getting something real. Gideon had, without any formal announcement, become the man who made the ranch run day to day. He didn't call it anything. He didn't ask for acknowledgement. He just did it, the way competent people do things when they've found the role that fits them and have the sense to stop waiting for someone to officially assign it. Caleb trusted him completely, which was visible in the way Caleb had started, using the morning hours he used to spend on logistics for other things, for sitting with Evelyn over coffee before the day started, for taking Miles out to the eastern pasture on a Saturday and teaching him things about cattle management that couldn't be learned in a kitchen. She watched this and felt something she didn't have a precise word for. Satisfaction was close, but not quite right. It was more like the feeling of watching bread that you put in an oven in the morning finally come out in the afternoon, exactly the way it was supposed, to the rightness of something that was always going to be this, if the conditions had been right. One evening in late August, she was sitting on the porch steps with the last of the day's light going orange over the mountains, and Miles came and sat beside her. He'd been out with Pete all afternoon, and he smelled like horses and hay, and the particular outdoor smell of a boy who had been doing physical work in good weather. They sat without talking for a while, then he said, "Can I ask you something?" "Always," she said. "When you walked here the 14 miles, did you know it was going to work out?" She thought about that. She took it seriously, the way he'd taken seriously the question of whether Gideon's complaints about the biscuits were about the biscuits. "No," she said, "I had no idea. I thought there was a chance and there wasn't anywhere else to go, so I walked. But you kept going even not knowing." "Yes." He was quiet for a moment. "Why?" She thought about it, really thought about it, because he was asking the question that mattered not what happened, but why she'd kept going, when there was no guarantee the going would lead anywhere. "Because the alternative was stopping," she said. "And stopping wasn't going to give me anything I didn't already have." Which wasn't much. She paused. "People talk about hope like it's a feeling, like you feel hopeful and that's what carries you. But I don't think that's how it works, not most of the time. Most of the time it's more like you can't see the end of the road, but you can see the next 10 feet of it, and the next 10 feet is walkable, so you walk it." He turned that over. She could almost see him doing it, the careful consideration. "And then the 10 feet after that," he said. "And then the 10 feet after that," she said. "The mountains were doing the thing they did at this hour. The blue going purple, going almost black at the ridgeline. The sky above them still holding the last light." She looked at them and thought about how many times she'd looked at mountains in Billings, in Miles City, on the road between places, and felt them as indifferent, as belonging to the kind of world that didn't particularly care whether you made it or not. They still didn't care. Mountains don't. That wasn't the point. The point was that you didn't need the mountains to care. You needed the next 10 feet to be walkable, and you needed, if you were lucky, to eventually find a place where the people cared, even if the landscape didn't. She'd found that. She hadn't expected to. She'd stopped expecting it somewhere between Billings and Miles City, which was probably the right thing to stop expecting, because expectation is its own kind of weight. But she'd found it anyway. Caleb proposed on a Sunday morning. She would not have predicted a Sunday morning. She might have predicted an evening, the porch, the lamplight, the way their conversations had always had their realist quality in the margins of the day. But it was Sunday morning, and she was making pancakes, and he came in from outside with mud on his boots from checking the creek level in the western pasture, and he stood in the kitchen doorway for a moment, watching her at the stove. Then he said, "Marry me." She turned around. He was standing there with mud on his boots and his hat pushed back on his head and his arms at his sides, and he said it the way he said most important things plainly, without decoration, with the directness of someone who has decided to say a thing and sees no reason to build a ceremony around the saying of it. "Not because of the ranch," he said, "not because of anything practical. Because I don't want a life that doesn't have you in it, and I'm done managing that from a careful distance." She looked at him. She thought about the 14 miles. She thought about the $4.30. She thought about every door that had ever been shut in her face before she'd had a chance to open her mouth. Every person who had looked at her and arrived at their conclusion and moved on. Every morning she'd gotten up in some other kitchen and done the work, and gone to bed and gotten up again, carrying the accumulation of all those closed doors. She thought about a cracked stove and a warped table and a lamp she'd decided to leave burning. "Yes," she said. "Of course, yes." He crossed the kitchen, the same kitchen he'd stood in on the first evening, and offered her $1.50 a week and the right to call it her own. And he put both hands on her face and he kissed her, and she kissed him back, and it was not a perfect moment. Her hair wasn't right, and he had mud on his boots, and the pancakes were on the verge of burning, and she had to step sideways to reach the pan and flip them before they went too far. He laughed. An actual laugh, full and unguarded, the kind she'd seen in flashes and glimpses for months, and had never heard at full volume. It was a good sound. It was the sound of a house becoming more fully itself. She would think about all of this later, much later, years later when she had the distance to see it clearly, and what she would think was not that it was a stories about someone remarkable. She had never been remarkable. She'd been stubborn and competent and willing to keep walking the next 10 feet, and she'd been honest about what she saw and said so when saying so mattered. And she'd kept the coffee hot and the lamp burning and the table full. What she'd learned over those months at Raven Creek was something she wished she'd known earlier, that belonging is not given. It is not extended to you because you qualify for it, or because someone decides you deserve it. It is built the way everything that lasts is built, slowly, imperfectly, out of the materials at hand, and with a great deal of patience for the days when it doesn't look like anything yet. She had built something here. Not alone that was the part that mattered. The part she'd have gotten wrong if she'd arrived at this place as a different kind of person. The kind who couldn't let anyone help. She'd built it with Caleb and with Gideon and with Roy and with Walter and with Miles most of all. Miles, who had needed to see someone who looked like a problem become someone who was simply a person, doing what she was capable of doing. That mattered. She thought about it sometimes the way Miles had been watching her from the beginning, taking notes in the way children take notes when they're trying to figure out whether the world is the way they've already decided it is, or whether there's evidence to the contrary. She'd been evidence. Not because she'd tried to be, but because she'd just kept doing the work, and the work had been visible, and he'd seen it. The woman nobody wanted had become, in the way of things that take time and require more than one kind of courage, the woman everyone needed. Not because she'd changed to fit the place, because she'd stayed herself, fully and without apology, until the place had the chance to understand what it actually had. On the evening of the territorial court's formal confirmation, the document that arrived 6 weeks after the hearing, the one with the official seal that meant it was finished, truly finished, Raven Creek Ranch belonging to Caleb Mercer and his heirs in full legal standing, no challenge pending, no dispute unresolved. Caleb put the document in the box with his father's land grant and closed the lid. They sat on the porch. All of them, or nearly, Caleb and Evelyn on the steps, Miles beside them, Gideon and Roy in the chairs they'd dragged out, Pete and the other hands in the yard, sitting on the fence rail or standing, nobody in any particular hurry to go anywhere. The evening was warm. The mountains were doing their evening thing with the light. Somewhere past the barn, in the western pasture along the creek, the cattle were settling for the night, with the sounds that cattle make when nothing is wrong. Nobody said anything important. That was the thing she would remember, that there was no speech, no toasting, no formal marking of the moment. They just sat there together in the place that was theirs, in the summer evening, and let it be what it was. Miles leaned against her arm. She let him. After a while, Gideon said something to Roy about the fence line near the northern paddock, and Roy said something back, and Pete got into it, and it became a conversation about something practical, the way all conversations at Raven Creek eventually did, because it was a working ranch, and the work was always there. She listened and did not say anything, and Caleb was beside her with his shoulder warm against hers, and the lamp in the kitchen window was burning behind them, the way it always burned, the way she always left it. The broken kitchen had become the heart of Raven Creek Ranch, and Evelyn Hart, who had walked 14 miles with $4.30 and worn boots, and not much more than the stubbornness to put one foot in front of the next, had become, in the only way that actually counts for anything, exactly where she was supposed to be.